glycerine, I thought they been knew it. All in my lungs, I got my red cup full of that hand fluid. Young middle Mac, I'm swinging that leg, I'm banging that do or die. And I ain't that before I get crucified. Living in my bloodline, this place in my family tree. How the they pressed, I did my best out of what they handed me. Straight out of that country, know my shawty thick as human air. And I need not mention no extensions, that's human hair. Boy, we grew in there. Around through that left side, low end. All of mine need more wins. If you got beef, don't come out, cause my young hitter might go in. Uptown GN, working all through my weekend. Hoping these don't show out, cause all of my hitters too deep in. Tell them no stress, no biggie. Baby, I'm just too jiggy. Better know I brought that with me, in case they get too iffy. Baby, don't stress, don't sweat it. Put it all on my baby. Know how I'm coming, and they know what we headed. Be that left side, low end. That left side, low end. That left side, low end. That left side, low end.
We were living in some projects, and they were new projects.
Yeah.
They had hot and cold running water. They had hot and cold running water, baby.
Welcome to Paradigm Shift TV 314. This is your brother, DMG the Poet, aka Brother Pianki. We got a powerful show for you with a very powerful guest. But before we get into our spiel, let me do my usual greeting. Let me say God bless to my Christian brothers and sisters. Let me say Hotep to all my Kemetic brothers and sisters. Let me say Assalamu alaikum to all my brothers and sisters in the NOI. Let me say Islam to all my Moorish brothers and sisters. Let me say peace to all my brothers and sisters in the nation of gods and earth, those 5%ers. Let me say what's up to all my atheist brothers and sisters. Shout out to all my Abo brothers and sisters. I want to say peace to all my Rasta brothers and sisters. And finally, I want to say Jambo to the rest of my brothers and sisters throughout the African diaspora, be it here in the wilderness of the United States of America or beyond. Y'all know I say that greeting for one reason and one reason only. It's because if you're Black, I'm with you. And I hope that you with me. Our different ideologies should not keep us from uniting. And we can have unity without uniformity. And we can disagree without being disrespectfully disagreeable. With that being said, please introduce yourself to the Paradigm Shift TV 314 audience.
Well, hey, great to be here, DMG. Really, it's quite an honor and a privilege. My name is James Valliant, and I'm the author of Creating Christ.
Definitely appreciate you coming, and we can get right into it. So my first question is, whenever I see somebody that writes a piece of work like this, it's definitely interesting. I've had a chance to kind of skim through because I ordered in anticipation, but I've been down with an illness and then just life in general. I hadn't had a chance to read it the way I wanted to.
Oh, everybody this year. Don't give it enough. No problem.
Were you ever a Christian?
Yes. Oh, yeah. My parents took me to church. I went to Sunday school. Was a liberal Protestant denomination, and I think I took it way more seriously than my parents did. They took their kids to church to teach them right and wrong, morality, because they didn't know where else to teach their kids ethics, right? Good and bad, not to lie and not to violate other people's rights, things like that. So it was really the moral compass that my parents were trying to instill in their kids. But I took it seriously, and I got into it. And I read, and I was a nerd. God, I was a super nerd as a kid. And so I read a lot of stuff, not just the Bible, but a lot of, secondary stuff. I took it seriously. At one point when I was a little kid, if you'd asked me, I'd have told you that I was going to be a professor of theology or a clergyman, something like that. All my friends called me Bible man because I was just so into Christianity. But I had a point early in my teens where I had a very sudden conversion. and there were lots of reasons that fed into that. But I lost my faith. I lost my faith altogether, is what I have to say. And then I started exploring philosophy, say, secular philosophy. I got my undergraduate degree at New York University in philosophy, and by then I was already a capital A atheist. I don't mean to offend anyone, but I really just don't have any belief in God. But I had all this knowledge about Christianity still bumping around in my head, and I didn't know what I was going to do with it. So I studied philosophy and history, and it took me and my co-author, took the two of us, about 35 years of research to finally complete Creating Christ. And I know we're academic outsiders on this topic, and that we have a very radical thesis. But I was just happy that it got published. I thought, maybe 100 years from now, someone had dusted it off, take it off the shelf. Well, maybe these guys had a point. I did not realize it would have the reaction that it's had. They made a documentary from it.
Yeah.
Now on YouTube and through Amazon. I was just amazed at the reaction. Professors like Eisenman and Robert Eisenman and others in the field have given me some great praise. Professor Marcus Vincent lately have given me some great praise that I did not expect. So that's basically my context.
And that's awesome. And I'll share this with you. So just this past March 28th, I reconverted to Christianity.
Really?
So yeah. So I understand. I take a lot of empathy towards non-believers because I was there. And so I'm never in a seat of judgment for those who say they have no belief. Now, of course, if it's disrespectful, if all of a sudden I lack intelligence because I believe, well then, we may have to have a conversation. But
good and intelligent people I know believe in God. It's
absolutely.
not a question. It's really a question of individual judgment.
Yes.
I do. Yeah, it's a serious question. I think it has ramifications for the rest of our thinking. I don't think any idea can be isolated, so that if something's true, it's going to help us with everything else down the line in our thinking. If something's false, though, it can create problems. That's why I'm very, very skeptical and careful about what I accept as true and not. It has to meet the acid test of reason, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. And I still have, issues with some elements of the Bible. Like I have an issue with taking the Exodus as a historical event. If my Christianity hinged on that, I would have a problem. But
Do you see the New Testament in a similar way? There are some people like Dominic Cross and scholars in the field who say the way we should really read the Gospels is not as literal historical truth, but as moral or spiritual truth, as allegory.
Yeah.
Is that how you look at it?
That's kind of how I look at some things in the Old Testament. As far as the New Testament, I actually believe it. And here's where my quandary comes in. And a good friend of mine, I consider him a brother. He told me, he was like, well, if you believe the New Testament, it shouldn't be that far-fetched for you to believe the stuff that you got an issue with in the Old Testament. And to be honest, he was right. And so I'm still kind of in that place where I'm like, I still look at that with, but I got a lot of good people, very intelligent believers that have taken me as a brother, and we engage in certain conversations, and they've been very educational. So I'm fortunate in that regard, whereas a lot of people don't have those type of resources. But I definitely understand, where you are and where many other people are, whereas some people may take offense to some of the things you say. And I'm like, wasn't that long ago I was there. So yeah, you don't have to bite your tongue with me.
Yeah. Oh, I hear you. Well, let me put it this way. One of the things that struck me is And see, if you're a believer, there's going to be a resistance to even the question that I ask, because the question that I ask coming into Christianity in particular is what caused it? Why did it occur at that moment in history, in that time and place? Why did it occur? Take the shape that it occurred, it took. Why does it have the ethics and the politics and sort of the ideological? How did it emerge ideologically from Judaism, Christianity, right at that moment? And as I was thinking about the subject, it became clear to me that in order to understand the answer to that question, we need to understand the context, the religious and political context included, of the first and second centuries when the New Testament came into being, when Christianity came into being. And it occurred to me that this great big Jewish war, in fact, multiple Jewish wars, in fact, before the war even started, decades before the war started, when the Roman Empire first put taxes, and in the beginning of Luke, in the Nativity story in Luke, Joseph and Mary are complying with the Roman census that was ordered in the year six, according to the Gospel of Luke. Well, that census was in preparation, of course, for taxes, and that set off the whole rebellion movement among Jews. And there was violence throughout the Roman Empire, throughout the first century, until it broke into a complete war. There was so much violence in Rome around 50 that the 4950 that the Emperor Claudius, among Jews, expelled all the violent Jews from Rome. That's how serious the violence was, religious motivated. Now, all our sources, Jewish and pagan, say that this Jewish war was motivated by the messianic prophecies of the Jews. And if you go back and you read Isaiah and Ezekiel and Daniel, the Jewish literature has predictions of a Messiah, a Savior that would come and politically and militarily liberate the Jews from their oppressor. And that's what they'd done it before in the second century BC at the Hanukkah revolt, when the Maccabees revolted, and they successfully pushed out the foreigners and reestablished Judaism in Jerusalem and the last independent Jewish kingdom before the Romans came. And they thought by rebelling against Rome, they'd have the same success, but they did not. The first Jewish war from 66 to 70 ended in the destruction. Josephus, the historian of this, says 1 million people were killed. He may be blowing the numbers up more than they were, but it's a huge war. It took more than 3 of the Roman legions to put down the Jewish revolt from 66 to 70 that was taking place in Judea. And it ended in the destruction of the temple, the reduction of the temple to the Wailing Wall that it is today. But the violence isn't done there. 60 years later, there'd be another, and in between time, there'd be violence, religious violence between Jews and non-Jews as well, religiously motivated. The Jews wanted to have a world where the Torah, Mosaic law, ruled, and they did not think that was possible under Roman rule. So most Jewish messianics of the first 2 centuries were political in their activism. Messiah was the rallying cry of the rebels. The second rebellion in the 130s in the second century under a guy named Bar Kokhba, son of the star, is a messianic rebellion. And all the messianic leaders who tried to rebel against Rome were claimed messiahs. They tried to be Messiah.
Yeah.
And so it struck me that this big Jewish conflict that was taking place in the first century and through much of the second century was not merely coincidentally connected to the emergence of Christianity. That Christianity, the New Testament, if you look at it sort of from the 30,000-foot elevation, and you just try and see the forest rather than the particular trees, if you look at look at it from the big perspective, it seemed to me that our New Testament is a critical reaction to the Messianic Jews who were rebelling against Rome. Think about it. Christianity stresses internationalism as opposed to nationalism, peace as opposed to militarism. It's Torah critical. You don't have to circumcise. You don't have to do kosher diet anymore. And so, in effect, what it's doing is it's altering the very cause, the nature of the religion that the Romans saw as the very cause of this giant conflict that they were fighting with extreme religious Jews at the time. And what Christianity is obviously internationalist, pro-peace, non-sectarian sort of version of Jewish messianism. And it struck me that it's a critical response to the rebels, that we can't really even understand a great deal of the New Testament except in light of the Jewish war. So, for example, the destruction of the temple plays a giant part in the Gospels. Jesus predicts the destruction of the temple. It's like a dire warning: don't rebel. The temple will be destroyed. Not one stone will be left on top of another. It's like Jesus is warning people not to rebel, that it'll end in disaster. And he goes in and he attacks the temple. He says, "You corrupted this place. It should be a house of prayer for all men, not just Jews." And he attacks the temple, in effect, physically commencing the attack that the Romans would complete in destroying the temple in 70, and morally justifying that destruction in the process. This place has become a den of thieves. And then when you look at the passion narrative itself, and I was talking to Bart Ehrman just last year about this, and he agreed with me. The leading critical biblical scholar in the world agreed with me that the passion narrative is really political fiction. That is to say, the Jews are being collectively blamed for the death of Jesus, while the Romans are being specifically exonerated. And so we have Pilate declaring Jesus to be innocent in all four Gospels.
I always felt like Pilate kind of gets let off the hook when I can't imagine in a man in his position with his power would have any problems with doing what ended up being done. So I do kind of understand the rationale there. But go ahead. I didn't mean to interrupt.
Oh no, it's okay. Please chime in. Pilate, is a saint in some Christian sects. The Eastern, I believe it's Coptic and Ethiopian churches still regard Pilate as a saint. Pilate is positively venerated in the Eastern Orthodox Church, but even in the Western Orthodox Church, his wife is Saint Procula. Saint Procula. So far from initially, at least, there being any negative idea about Pilate, it's plain, for example, when Pilate goes to the crowd, and he's, as I say, in all four Gospels, he says he's innocent of Jesus, and he would have released Jesus, but for this crowd, this Jewish crowd that's demanding Jesus's death 3 times artificially, and he finally yields. Okay, if that's the way, because as far as he's concerned, it's basically just a religious dispute among Jews. Historically, that doesn't make a lot of sense to me. I'll be honest with you. It seems to me the Romans crucified him because the Romans thought he was a threat. They crucified a lot of Messianic rebels in the first century, and most of them were actual violent rebels, advocates of violence. Torah Orthodox nationalist messiahs. And I suspect Jesus, and let me get into that a little bit. I think Jesus is not like he's presented in the Gospels. I think the Gospels are making the historical Jesus into something different.
So for me, you're not a mythicist. I want to make sure we got that.
No, I am not. No, I am not. I believe that there was a historical Jesus who was crucified by Pilate around the year 32 AD. So I'm not a mythicist. But a lot of what we discuss in our book, Creating Christ, really has nothing to do with mythicism or a lot of the technical issues that most scholars are concerned with. We accept standard scholarship and almost entirely. We're taking a broader view and looking at the cause of Christianity. Now, there's this letter that Paul wrote to the Galatians. It's a very interesting letter because in this letter, he's arguing with the leaders of the Jesus movement about things like circumcision and eating with Gentiles. He has to confront, he says, Cephas to his face over the issue of eating with Gentiles, because Paul thinks it's okay, but he's complaining that Cephas was a hypocrite for once eating with Gentiles. So he confronted him to his face. And apparently the leader of the Jesus movement was this guy named James, who sent men out to spy out on Paul's freedom in Christ. And it had something to do with circumcision, because he there mentions that his Gentile buddy Titus wasn't forced to be circumcised. And so it's issues about Torah orthodoxy. Is circumcision necessary? Is kosher diet necessary? It may not be full-on kosher diet that Paul's talking about in Galatians, but it's still issues like eating with Gentiles. So what Paul is doing, and we can see this throughout Paul's letters, is he's taking a new, radically new liberal stance on Torah. And in Galatians, he makes it plain that this is his idea. He says, I got what I'm about to tell you, the message I told you, Galatians, I did not get from any other man. I got it from my own revelation of Jesus Christ. In fact, he goes out of his way to show how minimal the contact he had with previous people in the Jesus movement was. And he insists that the things he's talking about right here in Galatians were his own revelation. Now, there are things in the Gospels, for example, where Jesus says, nothing you put into your body defiles. It's kind of a gross analogy. It's only what comes out of your body that's impure. Now, that's a very famous line from the Gospels. Now, if Jesus had actually said that, if Jesus had actually said what the Gospels say he said there about diet and impure foods, then why are James and Cephas, his closest disciple, and James, his brother, even arguing with Paul on the matter? Why aren't they simply saying, yeah, well, we'll do our thing and still be Jewish? Yeah, but circumcision, kosher diet, they don't matter anymore. There's so much of what Jesus says in the Gospels. Jesus says the Sabbath was not made for man, but man for the Sabbath, when his disciples are caught working on the Sabbath. Jesus says of a presumably uncircumcised Roman centurion. Now get this, in an age of rebellion, not just a Roman, but a Roman centurion. Jesus says he has more faith than any Jew. Full stop. And so there are a lot of things that Paul would have found convenient to quote that Jesus said or did from the Gospels, but he doesn't. He doesn't. He could have put an end to his argument in Galatians with James and Cephas simply by quoting the Jesus of the Gospels, but he doesn't. He does not cite any of the deeds or statements of Jesus that would have helped him and put the argument to bed, really, with James and Cephas. Instead, he's got the balls to argue with the guy's best friend and brother about what Jesus meant. And he's also insisting that he got it from his own revelation. I didn't get this from someone else. I got this from my own revelation. So far from quoting Jesus, he's saying, this is my new idea. This has led many scholars, including myself, to conclude that the Jesus movement before Paul was Torah orthodox, and that Paul is engaging in a good deal of transformation of Judaism as it was understood at the time. Paul is arguing in Romans and elsewhere, and in Galatians, that our relationship to the Torah has changed because of the death and resurrection of Jesus. And because of Jesus, we no longer need, he argues in 1 Corinthians, we've got a better temple than the temple, the big Jewish temple in Jerusalem. We've got a spiritual temple of which Jesus is the foundation, and all of us Christians are the other parts. So we're replacing the old temple with a new temple, a new redemptive mechanism called Jesus. And it strikes me that the authentic Jesus could not really have said and done the sorts of things that he is often said. Not that everything in the Gospels is wrong. I think there may be some important and factually correct information to glean from the Gospels, even though they're highly mythologized in my view, and they sort of transform Jesus into something else. Because if Jesus had been a liberal in the same way Paul was about Torah, the argument in Galatians makes no sense to me. Furthermore, if Jesus was crucified for claiming to be the heir of David, the son of David, king of the Jews, then because he's a political aspirant, he's one of these messiahs, political messiahs at the time, and that's why he was likely crucified, in my view, because he really was claiming to be an earthly king. His kingdom was of this earth, though the historical Jesus, but you see, the Gospels are going to transform that, and he's going to say, my kingdom is not of this earth, and completely take the political fangs out of Messianic Judaism, which was the rallying cry of the rebellion. When we look at Paul in Romans 13, Paul is definitely saying rebellion is a sin. Not paying your taxes is a sin. Obey the state because the state is God's appointed agent on earth. So this is no first century Jew would have been politically neutral on this topic. Religion, politics and religion were back.
I heard you say that to Vocab during his debate with Jacob. And I wanted you to go more in depth with that. And once you do, I do have a follow-up question, because I want to get into what sparked you, because you said you lost your faith as a teenager. I wanted to see what sparked you to get into this research, and about how old were you when that happened. But break down what you said about Paul and his exclamations about the government being an appointed agent and things of that nature.
Yeah, Paul, very straightforward, and it's obviously right in the face of the Jewish view that would lead so many to rebel against Rome violently for religious reasons. So there's no first century Jew who would not have understood what Paul was saying. It's pro-Rome, it's anti-rebellion, and he's taking a very sharp stance in the wider context of Jewish messianism of the first and second centuries. And he's definitely being pro-Roman here, and anti-rebellion. This is just what the Romans want to hear. Romans 13. In fact, the way Paul is transforming Judaism is just what the Romans want to do. They want, and this is what Romans did do. You know, in the debate the other day, one of the things that Vocab showed was this criticism by Carrier about Paul being, the idea of Paul being a Herodian. Well, Carrier gets it exactly wrong. There is no religion the Romans did not use for political purposes. There is no religion they did not transform into their own. Their general policy was to be tolerant of the various different religions of all the different ethnicities, because they were a multinational empire. But when they conquered a people, they let them keep their culture and their religion. And in fact, you'll see everywhere in the Roman Empire, side by side, dedications to Roman state gods and the local deities. I mean, whether this is in Gaul, Spain, North Africa, Greece, Cilicia, Phrygia, Syria, the Romans would take the local deities and would honor them side by side with their own state deities. And there's a Roman version of, in fact, it was very famous, the Romans simply absorbed Greek religion, but to a large extent, they absorbed other religions. There's a Roman version of the religion even of their enemies, the Parthians. Mithraism had a Roman version, but Egyptian religion, the cult of Osiris and Isis in the form of the cult of Serapis and Isis came to Egypt. So there was a Roman version of every Eastern religion. And if there hadn't been a Roman version of Messianic Judaism, it would have been a gap, a hole. But in any event, and the Romans
Sol Invictus from another culture, because that wasn't. Didn't they adopt Sol Invictus from another culture?
Well, Sol is the Roman word for sun, so it means sun in right. But sun worship, Sol Invictus is what we call a syncretism, a fusion of gods from different cultures, and so they combined different solar deities, sun gods, into one solar deity in a kind of monotheistic way. They wanted it to be the one God that everybody in the empire worshipped. And about the time of Constantine, that's what the Roman government was looking for. Now that by this point, by around 300, Roman emperors were looking for a single religion to unify, religiously and culturally unify the whole empire. That's what they thought the ticket was by that point. But the Romans generally were tolerant and absorbing of foreign ideas and foreign religions. A lot of people have noticed that Jesus himself appears to be a kind of syncretism, a kind of fusion of different religious ideas from different cultures. This would be a very remarkable thing among monotheistic Jews. And indeed, the conservative Jews who were rebelling against Rome would be the most resistant to the assimilation of foreign elements and foreign ideas. For example, within Judaism, the idea of a man god is completely anathema. There were miracle performers in the Hebrew literature, Moses, Elijah, but no one was a god, and no one was the son of God directly, like a virgin birth, agency of the Holy Spirit sort of thing. And nothing like that was anticipated, frankly, in Hebrew literature. But Paul is sort of developing a mystery cult, like these Greek mystery cults, around a suffering savior God, Jesus, which is very much like the religions of that time. The Greco-Roman religious milieu of that period was very much like Christianity. They'd worship a God who suffered and died on earth, but usually the son of a god and a mortal woman. and his suffering on earth. Asclepius is a great example, the healer god. He was born of Apollo and a mortal woman. He was such a great healer that he could bring people back from the dead, resurrect people. And this irritated the gods. And so they zapped him dead. But Apollo went to Zeus and said, "Can you make my son a god?" And Zeus said, "Yeah." And so Asclepius becomes a god who's worshipped both for his ability to heal and for giving you a better afterlife.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And Asclepius was sort of fused with the Egyptian god Osiris, who's the god of the underworld, who's chopped up into bits, and his wife Isis puts him back together to resurrect him physically. So Asclepius and Osiris, a Greek god of healing and resurrection, and an Egyptian god of the afterlife, who was himself physically resurrected, are fused by the early Ptolemies into a new god, Serapis, who's worshipped in Alexandria. And Serapis appears on Roman coins in the 1st century. So he's still being worshipped by Romans. And Jesus appears to have some of these elements that are foreign to Judaism. And the last place you'd expect that kind of assimilation is to be among Messianic Jews, the ones rebelling against Rome. They are separatists, they're sectarians, they don't want foreign influence. And they're strict monotheists and Torah Orthodox.
Yeah,
so what
they
Paul
definitely
is doing,
want any tributes to any foreign god. So I can imagine the uproar that brought when there was anticipation for statues being rose and things of that nature too.
well, the Romans, their attitude towards the Jews was very interesting. They did not insist, if you were going to show your loyalty to Rome, you'd either have to make an offering to the Roman state gods yourself, pray to the Roman state gods yourself, or at least pray to your gods for the sake of the Romans and the Roman gods. So prayers in the presence of the Roman state images was important, but the Romans made exceptions. For example, the Jews, being monotheists and violently opposed to idol worship. It's one of the 10 commandments, no graven images. And the history in the Tanakh of the trouble that Jews get into whenever they do fall prey to idol worship. So no idol worship. There's no symbolic representation of God permitted in Judaism. And so what the Romans said is Jews don't have to make any offerings in the presence of our idols. Just accept our offerings at your temple. And they allowed the Jews to actually enforce their own law until the first Jewish war came. The Romans could enforce even the death penalty, like the stoning of the sinning woman in the Gospels, or the stoning of Stephen. The Sanhedrin convicts Stephen early on in the book of Acts, and he's stoned under the Mosaic law for blasphemy. And the Jews could do that. Indeed, if the Jews had really been the ones who thought Jesus had committed blasphemy, Jesus would have been stoned to death like his brother James was by the Sanhedrin, or like Stephen was in Acts by the Sanhedrin. But no, it's a crucifixion, which leads me to believe Jesus was a real active threat to the Romans. And it was the Roman idea to crucify Jesus because they perceived him as a political rebel. And so it's all the more remarkable that Paul, our oldest writer of Christian material, is nakedly pro-Roman in his politics. And the curious thing is, he appears to have high-ranking connections. Look at what he's doing too. He's transforming the religion of violent Messianic Judaism, the rebel ideology, into a peaceful version of it. You see, submit to the evildoer, love your enemy, turn the other cheek, blessed are the peacemakers. That's exactly the kind of thing the Romans want to hear coming from 1st century and 2nd century Jews, right? And it's turning the religion into something that's less sectarian, less off-putting. The Romans thought, those Jewish people, they're standoffish snobs. They can't even eat with us. You can't even have lunch with one of those Jewish people. They're so picky about what they eat. And so the Romans have a lot of nasty anti-Semitism in early Roman literature. They thought that the Jews were haters of mankind. And so, you have ancient 1st century Roman sources calling them just that. And so what Paul's doing is sort of transforming the religion into something that's assimilated into the Greco-Roman world, where circumcision doesn't matter, were worshiping a man god. And also, Paul has all kinds of Greek philosophy there: Stoicism, Platonism. Professor Robin Faith Walsh has shown, in fact, that the New Testament is, Paul in particular, is a classic example of Middle Platonism, very much like Philo. The schools of Platonism that came after Plato, philosophers have identified, and he's maybe the quintessential Middle Platonist, Paul. And the New Testament certainly reflects Greek philosophical ideas that come straight from Plato, and also some Stoic ideas. The ideas of Paul and the Stoic philosopher Seneca. Seneca the Younger was the tutor to the Emperor Nero, and he was a Stoic philosopher who advised the Emperor Nero in the middle of the 1st century. And the ideas of Seneca and the ideas of Paul are so close. And I ask anyone if they want to do their own.
I've heard that before. I just started studying. I mostly study existentialism, particularly Black existentialism, like the work of Lewis R. Gordon, Franz Fanon. But I just started studying Stoicism.
It's fascinating. They had a kind of monotheistic belief too in God, and God controls all things, and fate is destined. So there's a sort of similarity between Stoicism in its philosophy and Paul. So close are the connections.
Running into that comparison with Paul and Stoicism, so it's interesting that you said that.
So close were their ideas of Paul and Seneca that early Christians by the 4th century had forged a correspondence between Paul and Seneca, who were contemporaries. They lived at the same time, and so they figured, how could they, since the ideas of Paul are so close to the ideas of Seneca, they must have known each other. But scholars have shown that the correspondence is a total forgery. But that's how close their ideas were, and so Paul is at least as much. So it's a very strange thing for a 1st century Jewish messianic thinker to be so assimilating of foreign ideas, foreign man god, Greek religion, Greek literature. People like Dennis MacDonald and Robin Faith Walsh have shown you don't have to believe everything that Dennis MacDonald says to see that there's a connection here between Greek literature and the New Testament. And it's unmistakable in many cases. And as Professor Walsh says, we're looking at classic Greco-Roman genre literature of the period in the Gospels as sort of these biographies of Jesus. And the least suspicious people in this regard would be your Messianic Jews, rebels. They wouldn't want any foreign influence, much less a pro-peace, pro-Roman, anti-rebel one that syncretizes the Jewish Messiah with Greco-Roman mystery cults, and which integrates Greek philosophy and literature into the mix. Astonishingly, we even have evidence that Paul had high-ranking connections with the Roman government. In Philippians, he says, he sends greetings from all those in Caesar's household. It has apparently multiple, even if they're slaves in Caesar's household, right? A quarter of the Roman population was slaves. And even if they're slaves in Caesar's household, these are the elite slaves of the empire. Some of these Roman slaves, Romans were very different than, say, the American slave experience. The American slave experience in some ways was much more brutal.
Well, they call it the peculiar institution for a reason, because there had never been an institution of slavery like that.
Well, so it kept African American slaves. It separated their families. It kept them illiterate. It was illegal to teach slaves how to read and write. Whereas in ancient Rome, some of the most highly educated people, the physicians and the teachers and the tutors, if you were a rich Roman, you'd hire a Greek, buy a Greek slave who maybe was trained in Ephesus or Alexandria to teach your kids. So the teachers, the tutors, the physicians, the secretaries, the people who really did a lot of that.
Essentially, Josephus was a slave for a while. and then I think they adopted him into the family because
Well, every hostage in war. I don't think Josephus was really technically a slave. I mean,
right,
all hostages are slaves, and
yeah,
so when a hostage is released and freed, they typically take. And this is similar to the American slave experience. Just like freed American slaves would often take the name of their previous owners, so it was in the ancient world that when you were freed from slavery, you would take the family name of your owner. So if the Emperor Claudius freed you, your name would be Claudius something. And so Josephus was a hostage in the Jewish war, was granted his freedom by Vespasian, and so took the name Flavius Josephus. See?
gotcha,
But
gotcha.
he was a very well-educated. Talk about one of these. And if he was a slave for a time, he was a very well-educated slave, even for
Well,
that
I just assumed because I know he was taken as a prisoner of war at first. So let me ask you this
fishy
because
story about. He gives us a fishy story about how he got over to the Romans, and he gives us a lot of other fishy stories. Before when Nero was still alive, he told Vespasian that he'd be emperor. He had a dream, and so forth. He had dreams that showed that God had gone over to the Roman side, and things like that, which a lot of historians doubt.
which I would say anything for him not to kill me. So
Yeah.
who knows what he said.
Well, yeah. So would I.
Let me ask you this because you said you lost your faith as a teenager.
Yeah.
What about when or well, first let me ask you, how did that affect, because I know you said your parents got you into church and Christianity. How did that affect your relationship with your family, particularly your parents, siblings, etc., when you lost your faith and walked away from Christianity?
Well, as I sort of suggested, I was more religious than my parents were. I took the
Okay.
natural part more seriously than they did. But they believed in, my mom was one of these California ecumenical liberals. So when when my parents first had their house together, she had a statue of Buddha, a picture of Jesus, and a photograph of my dad. My dad comes home from work and he says, "I'm sorry, you can only have one God in this house."
Oh man, I like your father. I like your father.
So it's a famous story of my family. But my family were they had sort of vague. My mom would say, "Well, all religions are getting at the same thing," and she was one of these ecumenical types who thought that all religions were basically. But she was oriented towards belief in God and the supernatural. When I became an atheist, I came right out of the college because my parents were very encouraging of philosophical discussion. If you wanted to talk politics, if you wanted to talk philosophy, religion, you name it, in our house we had arguments, we had discussions, and my parents very much encouraged their kids and all and they had their circle of friends were people who were interested in stuff. And so they encouraged discussion and they encouraged us to participate in discussion. So when I came out as an atheist, it took them aback a little, but I explained my situation. And within a couple of years, my whole family were atheists too.
Are you serious? Wow.
I'm serious. I'm serious.
Wow.
In
Okay.
effect, I converted them to atheism.
That's deep because, and I find it varies because my cousin is still an atheist, and my aunt is a stringent believer, and of course she's happy I'm back into the fold because she's like a second mother to me. But while they have their their philosophical conversations about God, she has not wavered in her faith, and he has not wavered in what I call his faith. So
Right. Well,
but love is still love.
I wouldn't call it faith in my atheism because it's nothing that I'm doing.
Exactly.
But
Exactly.
But on the other hand,
I do it to kind of tease him for the most part.
Yeah, and I hear your context. I mean, I have one grandmother who didn't believe in God. My other grandmother very much did, and I never talked about my atheism to her. It would just have hurt her. Would have broken her heart.
Yeah.
And so I avoided even discussing religion with my other grandmother. Um, uh, uh, as time wore on, I began to make some real insights in philosophy as a student. And those insights, I think, I read, for example, the works of Ayn Rand and Friedrich Nietzsche, and they helped liberate me from Christian ethics. And so I do not regard the ethical message of Jesus as my guide to life, is the way I'd put it. It's not just that I don't believe in God. I don't believe in the ethics of Christianity, that turn the other cheek stuff and love your enemy stuff. No,
Yeah.
no, 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 no. I mean,
Yeah.
I respect everyone's rights, and and I want to love as many people as merit my love. But love is a thing that,
Right.
you see, and to love your enemy is to destroy the concept love, in my view. And I'm not going to turn the other cheek when I can fight back. I'm not going to submit to the evildoer if I can fight back.
See,
Um,
that's another struggle I have. And I talked to my I call him my uncle pastor. He's my wife's uncle, but he's like my mentor, but he's the pastor of the church we attend. We got married at that church when I was 20, my wife was 19. Like I said, I'm 47 now, so
that'll always be a special place to you, whatever your beliefs.
absolutely. And that was kind of a thing to, even when I wasn't a believer, I would always be respectful of that church and the institution of the Black church. And so but he and I always talk because it's like Unc. I just feel like loving my enemy is counterintuitive. And he breaks it down in probably the best way I've heard it, but it's like I just feel like it.
Well, let's listen to
it's one of those things. I'm kind of like,
but look, there wouldn't we wouldn't have had wars against oppression. We wouldn't have had the civil rights movement. We wouldn't have had the Civil War. We wouldn't have had the American Revolution if people hadn't, if had people that obeyed Jesus, if they'd turned the other cheek and submitted instead of, remember, Paul says, rebellion's a sin. Well, sometimes we have to fight. Sometimes we have to fight for our freedom. When we can, we should fight. And even if it means violence. But there are certain religious Christian sects that take that very, very seriously. The Shakers, the Quakers, the Amish, they're in effect pacifists who take very seriously what Jesus said, as did Christians early on. It wasn't until Thomas Aquinas in the 1200s that self-defense was okay for Christians. You couldn't kill someone in self-defense. You'd have to be forgiven of that sin because Jesus said, turn the other cheek. And St. Augustine in 400 said, killing in self-defense, even if some madman's coming, I'm going to kill you, and coming at you with a knife, you cannot use deadly force in self-defense. Those
groups you spoke of, like the Amish and the Quakers, it's funny because they were some of the main proponents of abolitionism here in the United States when it came to freeing my ancestors from slavery.
And that's when you mention the Black church and churches in America in general, I do want to make a point that they were some of the leading voices of abolition. They were some of the great voices that fought slavery and on an ideological basis. There's something sacred, in my view, about that institution and its role in abolition. And see, I can think of things as sacred, and I'm a complete
absolutely.
But you see, when it comes to freeing human beings, when it comes to human freedom and human rights, sometimes we have to fight. And and the aggressor is wrong. I mean, we have a right to fight back. And it struck me, though, when I read the critiques of Christian altruism from these philosophers, it struck me then that the ethics that were being taught in Christianity is very consistent with the entire political, ethical agenda that I'm laying out here. The Romans would want the Jewish Messiah to be telling, the Jewish Messiah, mind you, to be telling people to turn the other cheek, submit to the evildoer, love your enemy, pay your taxes. And rebellion's a sin, folks, and centurions have more faith than any Jew. In that age of rebellion, it strikes me that turn the other cheek has a political dimension, and that Jesus takes his altruism to such an extent that I think it's part and parcel of see, my theory of Roman providence is explaining the cause of Christianity. why it happened then, and why it took the form that it did. So the essence of Christianity's fusion of Judaism and Greek religion and philosophy, or why it came about at that very moment and in the form it did, I'm explaining, including the substance of its ethics. Why did Christianity come about then and take this form? And I believe I've offered a causal explanation of a scope that is not normally presented in the origins of Christianity. I don't want to take anything precious away from anybody, but it was important for me, as a historian, and I treat the subject like a scientist, to try and understand the cause of the nature of the ideology and the nature of these documents, because they have had such a profound influence on the rest of history for the last 2,000 years. The most influential philosophy of the last 2,000 years surely has been Christianity. But it's Christianity has changed over time too, as I just indicated. And it's that ability to change over time that has allowed Christianity to adapt to science when it was first resisting science. Galileo and Darwin, anesthesia, all provided sort of intellectual challenges to Christians through the centuries. But Christianity made a huge compromise and said, no, we're going to live with science. We're going to live with reason. We're going to live with individual freedom. That was a big thing for Christianity to accept too, because most, God's appointed agents on earth, Romans 13. Well, for most of Christian history, kings like Louis XIV cited Romans 13 and said, "L'état c'est moi." L'état c'est moi, baby. I am the king, and therefore I'm the appointed of God and the absolute ruler of France. And it was biblically based absolute monarchy. You won't find freedom of speech, freedom of religion. You won't even find an opposition to slavery in the Bible. On no less than 4 occasions in the New Testament, slavery is endorsed. In fact, even having a harsh slave master is considered a lucky break in the New Testament. You're earning brownie points in the kingdom of God. So consider yourself lucky if you have a harsh slave master. You'll read in one of Paul's letters. But Jesus, this is consistent with Jesus's, own approach. He imitates slave behavior in washing the disciples' feet. He says, the first shall be last and the last shall be first. Now talk about a direct answer to the rebels. The disciples, I think, are stand-ins for the rebels in the Gospels. They are asking, who's going to be first in the kingdom? And Jesus says, you disciples are all messed up. It's not about here, who's going to be first here on earth, an earthly kingdom. No, the lowest guy here is the highest guy over there. The first shall be last and the last shall be first, inverting this idea that the Messiah would be even an earthly king. And that he's diffusing the idea, this political idea of Messiah, in his disciples' minds over and over again. I think unmistakably. One of Jesus's disciples is even called a zealot, Simon the Zealot.
Now you mentioned that this was a compilation of 35 years of research.
Yes, sir.
How old were you when something kind of sparked and said something doesn't sound right? Because I know you had stopped believing, but at what point did you think I need to look into Paul and look into the formulation of this belief under the auspices of the Roman Empire?
Well, I just completed my undergraduate work at NYU, studying philosophy and history. And so I had all these ideas bouncing around. I wanted to be a lawyer. And so in preparation, and I was for 18 years a public prosecutor. I was a deputy DA in San Diego and prosecuted felonies of all kinds. You
actually gave me some great advice on a particular situation. So definitely.
My pleasure. Anytime. In wanting to become a lawyer, and that was kind of my childhood dream after losing my religion, I still wanted to be an advocate for something. And before I went to law school, I was clerking at a law firm in downtown LA, a relatively big, famous law firm in downtown LA. And they would kick me out right at 5 o'clock because of the billable hours. I said, well, why can't I stay? Because I hated the traffic in downtown LA. I was, between 5 and 7, it's hell on Los Angeles freeways. The go home traffic is awful. So I'd say, can't I stay? And they said, no, 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 you've got to get out of here. So they kicked me out at 5. And they literally kicked me out of the office at 5. And so I didn't want to deal with traffic. So I went to the library, the big public library in downtown LA. It's the old Art Deco, beautiful building. And I said, well, what am I going to read? And because I was sitting there with all these books in front of me, I said, I've always wanted to reread the works of Flavius Josephus. So I was rereading Josephus in light of everything that I'd learned previously about philosophy and history. And suddenly I had a sort of an epiphany, a light bulb, a eureka moment went off when Josephus is describing the Jewish war. And he describes, there's a moment when he says that at the siege of Jerusalem, armies were seen fighting in the clouds. And that reminded me of Jesus's prediction of the very event. Jesus, of course, Mark 13, but in the other 2 synoptics as well, predicts the destruction of the temple, predicts the Jewish war, and he predicts it in such detail that many scholars believe that the prophecy was written after the destruction. And furthermore, Jesus says that at the same time, because he says all these things will happen within the lifetime of people who were hearing him right then. And Jerusalem was destroyed within 40 years. The temple was destroyed. But he also says that something else will happen within the lifetime of his listeners. The Son of Man will come in power and glory. And he evokes the Son of Man prophecy from Daniel, the late Hebrew prophet Daniel. And it was clear to me that Josephus is also saying that there's the fulfillment of the Son of Man clubbing glory in the clouds in the sky. That's exactly what Josephus is invoking in trying to say that happened at the time of the fall of Jerusalem. So in effect, Josephus, the historian, is saying that everything that Jesus predicted came true. And if that's true, see, most prophecies, I'm an atheist, I believe most prophecies are written after the event. And this is true, I think scholars recognize, of most Hebrew prophecies too, written after the event. And if that's true, if the Jesus prophecy of the destruction of the temple is written after the event, then I would ask, wait a minute here, is Jesus predicting a glorious coming as Josephus is? Because Josephus was predicting it in the context of Vespasian being the Messiah. Josephus, even though he's a Jew, a Jewish priest, mind you, a former rebel, he's gone over to the Roman side, and he says that my boss, the Roman general Vespasian, who became emperor because he defeated the Jews, is the Jewish Messiah of prophecy. And the Roman historian Tacitus, the Roman historian Suetonius, even the Jewish rabbi Yohanan ben Zakkai, all state, in effect, that Vespasian was the true Messiah. So in Jesus's prophecy, he is in effect, it seemed to me, by inference, agreeing with Josephus that the Son of Man prophecy had been fulfilled at the destruction of Jerusalem, and that the Flavians were their object. The Flavian emperors, Vespasian and his son Titus, were both regarded as Jewish messiahs, And they had Josephus, this Jew, who was working for them as their official historian and propagandist. So the Roman government itself, under Vespasian and Titus, was using the Jewish religion for its own propaganda, for its own propagandistic purposes, taking the very ideology of the enemy, the Messianic Judaism that they were fighting in the rebels, and saying, no, we're the Messiah. So they're using the enemy's own religion and ideology for their own propagandistic purposes. And you can really read it elaborately spelled out in Josephus, who's writing his histories as their official propagandist and historian, in effect. And so it struck me that perhaps the Jesus prophecy was originally written as a proof text for Flavian claims here. And that led me to think that, well, wait a minute here. Is the New Testament, in effect, Roman propaganda? We have Paul saying rebellion is a sin, not paying your taxes is a sin. The state are the appointed agents of God on earth. We have Jesus praising a centurion, his faith above that of any Jew. The entire Passion narrative is a fictional allegory blaming the Jews collectively for the death of Jesus. See, you guys deserve to lose the Jewish war. And in fact, that's exactly what the Gospels are saying. There's a parable, you probably know the vineyard parable. Jesus tells the owner of a vineyard leases it out to people who are mismanaging it. So he sends a servant and they beat him up or kill him. And so they say he sends another and the same thing happens. So he sends his beloved son and they kill his beloved son. And God says that they will be deprived of the vineyard because of that. That is clearly an analogy saying that because you killed Jesus, you're going to lose Judea. And it's built in a allegorical form in the parable of the vineyard that Jesus himself articulates. But you can see it in the passion narrative that all four Gospels share. It's clearly fiction, and it's clearly political fiction, designed to exonerate the Romans for a clearly Roman execution and to collectively blame the Jews. In Matthew's version, he even has the crowd simultaneously, I guess, in unison, saying, yes, his blood is on us and on our children. Wow.
Can you see the screen?
Yeah.
And while you're looking at that, I want to ask you: has anyone ever given you a criticism or remarked about the similarities between your work, if there are any, between the work you do and what is it, Joseph Atwell, Caesar's Messiah? Are there any?
I certainly cite Joseph Atwell's Caesar's Messiah in my book, and I cite Professor Eisenman, who articulated something similar even earlier. I came up with this in the early 1980s. And even before the publication of Caesar's Messiah, I published an essay in which I asserted that the Flavians played an important role in shaping Christianity. So long before Caesar's Messiah was published, or I'd even heard of Atwell, I had this theory pretty much developed that the Flavians had played a key role, that the Roman government even was likely to have played a key role in the development of Christianity. In 1996, when I read Professor Robert Eisenman's James, the Brother of Jesus, he made an argument very similar to one that I'd already made myself. So I immediately got on the phone with Professor Eisenman to praise his book. I have some differences with Eisenman. I disagree with his identification of certain personalities in the Dead Sea Scrolls and his dating of the sectarian scrolls. I have a lot of disagreements with Joseph Atwell. He has a lot of crazy beliefs about other things. His political beliefs are wacky, but he does have some good, important insights into the parallels between Titus in his conquest of Jerusalem and the story of Jesus in the Gospels. Let me just give an outline a little bit. Where do the Romans start? Vespasian starts by conquering.
Please keep going. I need to step away for a quick second and check out the screen while you going. But I'll be right back.
Okay. Let's see. Where was I? The
disagreements with Joseph Atwell.
Right, disagree with Joseph Atwell. Joseph Atwell believes several things that I disagree with. He thinks it's basically a Roman joke, and I don't see that at all. I see it as I was saying earlier, in a way, sincere allegorical religion from people who saw it as an allegory. The authors of the Gospels knew that they weren't telling literal historical truth. I think they were teaching metaphorical truth by means of allegory. And I don't think it was a joke to them. I think there were many high-ranking Jews like Josephus who did want to assimilate with Rome and get along with Rome. And they believed that their Judaism was like Philo. They believed their Judaism was consistent with Greek philosophy, with Stoicism or Platonism. And I think it was a sincere thing on the part of many people, Jewish people who were trying to get along in the Greco-Roman world. Issues like circumcision and kosher diet were of importance to such people, including, say, for example, the Herods. But we have, for example, surrounding Titus, the Emperor Titus, we have all kinds of important Jews. The nephew of the Jewish philosopher Philo was a friend of Tiberius Alexander. was a friend of Titus, and he was there with Titus at the siege of Jerusalem. Herod Agrippa II and his sister Berenike, Herodian royals, were there at his side at the siege of Jerusalem, and the Jewish priest and historian Josephus was there at Titus's side. So there's a whole coterie of elite Jews, and you can imagine throughout the empire, of course, there were Jews who were prospering and doing well and wanted to get along with the Roman Empire, and they, in a sincere way. As I say, religion and politics were intermixed in everyone's mind in this time, Roman or Jew. So if you're a Jew, for example, at the time of, let's go back in time to, hundreds of years before the Roman-Jewish War, to the Babylonian conquest of Jerusalem. When the Babylonians sacked and destroyed the first temple, the Jewish response was not, of course, well, those polytheistic idol worshippers had God's favor. No, they couldn't say that, because if we're the believers, God's chosen people, and we're the believers in the one true almighty creator God, how could he be rewarding these polytheistic pagans, idol worshippers? No, we must have done something wrong. We, the one true all-powerful God's chosen people, must have broken our covenant with God. We screwed up. And so the way Jewish literature tells the story, we married foreign wives, we worshipped idols, and so we got what was coming to us. The temple was sacked, and it was only when the Persians conquered the Babylonians that the Jews were allowed to come back and build the second temple under Ezra and Nehemiah. In that instance, there's a curious thing. The Persian king of kings, Cyrus, is being called the first time anyone in Hebrew literature is called Messiah. It pertains to this foreign king Cyrus, who lets the Jews rebuild their temple. So within Judaism, because of its monotheism, if the Jews lose, there has to be some divine explanation. God is in control of everything. And why should we, God's chosen people, ever lose? Because he's the almighty, powerful. And if you read the Dead Sea Scrolls sectarian documents, you'll see they expected divine help, and they'd win in their battle against their foreign oppressors. That's what they're expecting. If necessary, armies of angels will come down and fight on their side and defeat the enemies of Israel. But what do you do when you lose the Jewish war? This is going to create a psychological and religious crisis on the part of Jews. Why did we lose it all? How did the temple get destroyed? We need an explanation, and the Gospels, in effect, provide that explanation. You all misunderstood the concept of Messiah altogether. He's not an earthly king. He's a spiritual being, and his kingdom is not of this earth. You all misunderstood completely, and you killed your own Messiah, and you got what was coming to you. That's built into the vineyard parable. I think it's built into all four Gospels, passion narrative, metaphorically, which I regard as a fictional political parable, as I say. But all early Christians, Eusebius, you name it, or Origen, they all saw it in the same way. The Jews lost the Jewish wars because they killed their true Messiah. And that is unfortunately, that serves as the built-in grounds for anti-Semitism within Christianity. During the Middle Ages, when Christians would put on passion play performances, that would cause the locals to get all angry and go beat up the local Jews. They go attack the local Jews after washing. The Jews killed Jesus, you see. It was only in the 1960s that the Pope officially forgave the Jews collectively for killing Jesus.
I was just about to ask you, so because I grew up and it was like respect God's people, meaning people of Jewish descent and things of that nature. Don't speak ill of them at all. That was something that was told to me growing up.
Yeah.
And I was about to ask you, so when did that sort of shift? Or is that purely an American thing?
Well, there is something distinctly American about the philo-Semitism of American Christians. It is different than in Europe. See, a lot of the Christians who came to America came here because they belonged to religious, even though they were Christians, they belonged to unusual Christian sects, Puritans, or Baptists, and they were being persecuted in Europe because they were unusual Christian sects. And so they fled to America to escape persecution. And so they have, I think there's a psychological connection between American Christians and Jews because they were both persecuted and by Christian governments in Europe. So there's a connection there. But I think it's more than that as well. Yeah, my grandmother definitely told me that the Jews are God's special people, and you respect them. And she was a sincere Bible reading Christian, and she definitely had this. In fact, she had the prophetic view that the Jews will have to return to Zion, build the temple for the final second coming of Jesus to actually happen. The Jews have got to rebuild their temple. So the forming of the state of Israel in the 1940s was of prophetic importance to my very Christian grandmother. No, Christianity is built on Judaism. And I want to say that loud and clear. It is whatever modifications Paul and the other early writers of the Greek New Testament were making, they saw themselves, at least at first, as Jews, as believers in Yahweh, and in effect fulfilling, and everything had to be a fulfillment in effect, even if they had to be sloppy, so to put it generously, with the way they interpreted Hebrew scriptures. It still had to be of the fulfillment of Hebrew scripture for them. On the other hand, within Judaism, you can see that Paul is a real elbow, a real change. With respect to, say, Torah, with respect to God, man, and with respect to the deep Hellenization of the religion, if that makes sense.
It does. It does.
Now,
Now
there's this tension between Christians. There's always been this tension between Christians and Jews, because you see, Christians. Look at the New Testament itself. There's an increasingly strident anti-Semitic tone to the Gospels, till by the time you get to the Gospel of John, which most scholars regard as the latest to be written, Satan has possessed Judas. Satan has possessed the Jewish people. We have a certain degree of replacement theology going on in the New Testament in its later forms. See, the Jews were merely the drum roll. They were the preparation. They made the Messiah possible. But after that, it opened it up to the world. And there were other things. Jews could charge interest on loans. Jesus said, don't charge interest on loans. So through much of Christian history, Christians had to rely on Jewish people to be bankers. And that led to a great deal of resentment. So they needed them. They used them financially, but then they grew to resent them because they owed them money. And so the cliche stereotype of the greedy Jew became the classic anti-Semitic trope within Christianity. So there are multiple reasons for Christian anti-Semitism, but a lot of them are built into the New Testament itself, I'm afraid.
So now, do you feel, because a lot of people cite the Jews asking for saying, give us Barabbas and crucify Jesus as one of those elements where anti-Semitism is sort of sparked, because they asking for a rebellious murderer versus this man who is preaching peace and pacifism and things of that nature. Why is that one of the elements that you view, or that's generally viewed by non-believers, you think as anti-Semitic?
Well, I think that again, it's a mixed case, because we always have to have a little asterisk, a little set aside, because Jesus was Jewish, and his disciples were Jewish, and so and like I say, it's predicated on the Hebrew religion. So there's something inescapable about Judaism within Christianity. The Barabbas story is particularly fascinating because it really highlights, I think, the political nature, not so much the anti-Semitic nature, but the political nature of the message. Pilate, in that version of the story, actually gives the Jewish crowd a choice. Should I release this rebel, or should I release Jesus? And of course, the crowd demands the rebel be released, and Jesus be crucified. That is condemning the Jewish people very clearly, and definitely taking a political side against the rebels, who were, let's face it, the Jewish rebels of the first 2 centuries, as Messianic Jews, surely outnumbered our New Testament Christians by quite a way. So Christians were sort of a smaller group within the Jewish Messianic movement of the first 2 centuries at the time, and an unusual one in this respect. They're trying to assimilate with the Roman Empire. They're distinctly pro-peace, and they're altering the whole concept of Messiah from a political military one into a purely spiritual one.
Gotcha. Let me ask you, we're a little bit over an hour. Are you ready to run the gauntlet?
Sure.
And open it up for questions, because
let's do it.
We got a lot of people who seem to be eager to engage. So you did mention that you cited Joseph Atwell's work, but you're not in complete agreement with him.
Right. I have several important disagreements with him, but I would also recommend the works of Francesco Carota. Again, I have disagreements, but I think it's important. The work of Rosemary Sheldon and Theos Voskuilen, Operation Messiah, which makes the argument that Jacob was making the other night, that Paul was in fact a Roman agent. And if you read the book of Acts, there's a really good case to be made. It's Roman officials that are constantly saving Paul from Jewish crowds who are angrily pursuing him. It's always Jewish crowds that are pursuing Paul in the book of Acts, and it's always Roman officials pulling him out of trouble. When he goes back to Jerusalem, the Romans send an entire, according to the book of Acts, I don't regard Acts as always historically accurate, to put it mildly, but even if it's vaguely based on anything real, Acts says that the Romans gave an entire cohort of their army, an entire military unit was sent out for the protection of Paul. For one man, Paul, an entire cohort, hundreds of Roman soldiers were sent out to protect one man, Paul, when Jews were out to get him in Jerusalem, according to Acts. If he doesn't have the official protection, if anything like that is true, if he didn't have the official protection of the Roman government, I don't know what could prove it.
Yeah, that's it. I'm not gonna lie, it's fascinating, and I'm very interested in the fact that you were kind of working on this before, Caesar's Messiah, and some of the
25 years before Caesar's Messiah, even 15 years before Professor Eisenman.
Okay, yeah, and that's kind of interesting to me too. And another thing that I find interesting is the fact that I think that unlike other people who sort of have this same assertion, you don't think that there wasn't a historical Jesus. You just believe that.
That's a big difference with me and Atwell. Yeah.
Yeah.
He's hedged in interviews, but in the book, he's clearly a mythicist. And there I do disagree with him. I don't think you need to take a stance on mythicism versus historicism to see the Roman provenance of the New Testament. I think that's a separate issue. I think there are all kinds of technical issues in biblical scholarship that don't particularly matter. There's each of the Gospels was written for a distinct community, has a distinct agenda, but those slight differences are really slight differences on the scale of explanation that I'm talking about. Matthew, which appears to be the most Jewish of the Gospels, in fact, has some of the most anti-Semitic elements, such as the Jews collectively taking blame for Jesus's death and things like that. You find the same pattern of the pacifist pro-Roman, the praise of the centurion is in Matthew, for example. So, but look at the, every little detail. I mean, Luke's nativity story, Joseph and Mary are complying with the Roman census, aren't they? And Jesus' parents are good Romans. It's that census that set off the whole Jewish revolt. So it's as though the gospel writer of Luke is specifically saying that Jesus' family is not to be associated with any of those rebels when the man ends up crucified.
I'm glad. I gotta admit this. And family, I'm about to open it up And what I want to do, I don't want to get into a debate or a long drawn out back and forth between whoever comes up and Jim. I don't mind setting up a future conversation, not necessarily a debate, but a moderated conversation where I could sort of manage the time, 10 minutes, 12 minutes, whatever the case may be, 5 minutes. And that way it won't get sort of out of hand. It doesn't have to be a debate. It could just be a conversation, especially with my brother Vocab. I think my brother, the Slim Reaper, would also be a good candidate for such a conversation. So I just dropped the link to both of you all because I want you both first up, and then I'll drop it in the chat. But also, channel memberships are open. One of the perks outside of what you see on YouTube is I am giving away complimentary trips. Only thing you're responsible for is taxes and fees. But you do qualify for one of those trips, and I'll be doing a raffle once or twice a month where you won't even be responsible for the taxes and fees. I'll take care of it. So as long as it's within the continental United States. So definitely look into that. It's $4.99 a month. And every month I'll be doing a raffle for those complimentary trips. So please take advantage of it. It's legit, no scams. So check that out. One thing I want to say is I'm glad I gave my life back to Christ before I met you. Because you make a compelling, yeah, absolutely. You make a compelling argument. And I will say, I'm like, man, because you don't disregard history, but you still make a compelling argument as to why you come to the conclusion that you do. So I'm glad I gave my life back to Christ before I actually got introduced to you and your information. So we got my good buddy, the Slim Reaper, in the building. This is a very well-educated young man, one of the pillars of my platform, and
Not true.
I will ask his question.
This is not true.
Don't be modest now. Don't be modest now.
Listen,
what is that you have on your What is that you have on your head? Right?
This is a religious garment. Don't worry about what this is.
What religion is that?
This is something else.
Yeah.
Okay,
Trey says when he put on that do-rag, it's gonna be smoke. So let's see if you bring smoke to Mr. Valliant.
No. Listen, I'm in the presence of a very educated man. Shout out to you, Dr. Valliant. If you don't know, lawyers or doctors, they're just very modest about it. So shout out to Dr. Valliant.
I am modest about it. I don't normally I have a Juris Doctorate, but I just call me Jim.
Yeah. So Jim, thank you for your time here. I just had a couple questions really about some of the things you said, and I know you'll appreciate this. One of the is basically as it relates to method, right, and how this sort of thing was accomplished. One of the questions is what would you say the mainstream sort of philosophical system of Rome was at the time, and also if you could tell us also what time period this was when the Gospels themselves would have been created. Or edited, or however you would phrase it. I haven't read the work. I was listening to the presentation here.
Yeah, that's okay. I normally take a very standard view on the dating of the Gospels. I believe they could not have been written before. Many scholars agree with this. They could not have been written before the Jewish War, sometime after the destruction of the temple. Mm-hmm. In fact, I'm willing to go as far as the 2nd century potentially for this material. I think I will leave the dating of the material. The theory. Let me put it this way: the theory of Roman providence. I have very definite opinions about each of the specific steps that it took, but my answer to in my own head is still a hypothetical one, right. And there are many technical issues that my theory doesn't rely upon. So, for example, you'll hear some people say, well, Matthew relied on Luke, or Luke relied on Matthew. That's outside my area of concern. I believe that the authentic Pauline epistles, and I agree with most scholars that we have pseudo-epigrapha, pseudo-Paul, the pastorals, is definitely not written by Paul, but we also have authentic material from Paul. And I do believe that material dates from, I take a pretty conservative date on that. It could date from the 40s, as far as I could see. But mid first century for the authentic letters of Paul, which are the very earliest Christian literature, and then sometime after the Jewish War, up to the Second Jewish War, you have important Christian literature being written, I believe.
Okay, thank you. And so given that the sort of early dating that we're talking about for the Gospels and for the authentic letters of Paul, at what point in time would would the Romans have gotten involved, I guess, in these texts? Did they edit these texts, or because these texts, they wouldn't have been, I guess, originally created by the Romans? Would they have edited these texts, or like circulated the Gospel?
No. I think they were behind. Let me put it this way. I do not think that the Roman government had a hand in creating our Gospels. This is another difference that I have with Joseph Atwill. Right. As I say, I think that the Gospels themselves are the product of the four Gospels we have are the product of four distinct approaches. And you can really identify four distinct agendas theologically, and the slight nuances between them. And so I think they're reflections of their communities that developed over time. And but I think the original idea, the creation of this Jesus, as we see, because look at what I'm saying, the Gospels passion narrative shared in all four Gospels. I believe there's an underlying source to all the Gospels that really was motivated for political reasons and with the Roman government's approval. I actually do. Yeah. And it's at sometime in the late first century under the Flavians that I believe that real Jesus took shape in our gospel sense. But Paul was writing earlier than that, I believe. The Romans would have had a motive to be interested in Jewish messianic activity from the moment the rebellion broke out in 6 of the Common Era. By mid-century, as I say, Claudius is expelling the Jews from the city of Rome. When Caligula wanted to set up an image of himself in the Jewish temple, that almost sparked the Jewish war happening way back in 39. So we're looking at a period of all kinds of messianic violence leading up to the Jewish war from 66 to 70, which results in the temple's destruction. So really through most of the first century, there's this violent, militant, nationalist, Torah Orthodox, traditional Jewish messianism, which is motivating most Jewish messianics of the first 2 centuries and creating the Jewish rebellion. Our New Testament, written in Greek, takes a very different philosophical and political stance than the Jewish rebels, and that's the contrast that I would draw between those two groups. It's curious to me, as I say, that Paul in the book of Philippians has multiple contacts in the household of Caesar. He says that he's boasting that the word has become known to everyone in the Praetorium. Many scholars think that this is the Praetorian Guard at Rome. Some say that it could just be a military unit somewhere in the empire, but it would mean the whole military unit, the building that the soldiers were in, the Praetorium. But that means that Paul had access to an entire military unit of the Roman army. If he's a political prisoner, how on earth does he have access to the point where he knows that everyone in this military unit has heard the word and he can tell them the word? Now, that couldn't have happened under the Roman radar screen. In fact, the Romans had to have known and approved of what he was doing. And it would make sense that he has multiple contacts in Caesar's household. And that dovetails with his pro-Roman, pro-peace politics at Romans 13. It dovetails with his saying that he has friends in the household of Aristobulus, the Herodian prince. It dovetails with many, many other things. In the book of Acts, like I say, we're told that the Romans sent an entire cohort of their army to protect that one man, Paul.
Right. Yeah. So here's my question. What would you say the population of Christians was at the time when Rome decided?
I'm sorry, what the
population of Christians was in the empire during the period of time where the Romans got involved?
Subscribe now.
The term Christian didn't really. Paul doesn't use the term Christian.
Mhm.
We're told that in the book of Acts, Gentile believers in Antioch is where they first used the term Christian.
Mhm.
But in literature, the first time it seems to be used, maybe in Josephus, if you buy the Testimonium in the Antiquities. But certainly, it's only really in the 2nd century that we have the really secure references to the term Christiani. Pliny the Younger in his letter to Tacitus, and it's 2nd century sources that first tell us that there is even such a term. I think 1st century Christians just saw themselves as Jews. Now, when there was a growing number of Gentile converts, they need a new term. And when they're being perceived as different. And that separation occurred over a period of time, too. I think by the end of the Second Rebellion in the 2nd century, there's a real distinction. And you either see yourself as a Christian or as a Jew. But before that time, they're just a form of Judaism, if that makes sense.
Nomenclature aside, though, how many people were believing what Paul how many people would be believing what Paul was believing about this Christ that he would have been writing about in letters to Romans, Corinthians, those sort of things? Whatever the authentic letters of Paul are.
Around 50, I think the percentage of Pauline Christians is pretty small. In other words, Paul's circle is a relatively small group within Judaism. And
and so given that, I guess I'm trying to figure out here motives for the Roman government, where you have them sort of being involved or interested in using a really obscure movement to try to persuade the Jews when there was such a small amount of people, even by the 2nd century. So I was hoping you could speak to that.
Well, Paul is infiltrating a very important movement. I think the Jesus movement was important. Josephus refers to the execution of Jesus, I believe. And I also believe that Josephus refers to the execution of James, his brother. And that would put them on the map as relatively significant figures. Indeed, in the execution of James, it's the Sanhedrin taking advantage of the absence of the Roman governor. And apparently the Romans were sensitive about executing these big ideological leaders. But the Sanhedrin convicts James. And when the Roman governor gets there, he replaces the high priest in punishment. The Romans were being more sensitive, at least about the execution of James. And that suggests to me that the Jesus movement, of which James was the leader, was relatively important and one of the main rebel sects, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So Messianic Jews. So after the war, when the rebels have lost, the Romans have got thousands and thousands of new Jewish slaves, captives of war. If you survived the Jewish war and you were taken in battle, you would be sold as a slave. And we now have to pacify a whole bunch of slaves who are former Messianic Jews. But they have this psychological shock I was describing earlier. We've lost this war. The temple's destroyed. We need a new redemptive mechanism. We need, in fact, why did we lose the war? Did God punish us? More than that, the Romans would want to pacify any continued Messianic militancy. Their motive it seems pretty clear. The degree of their success, I think, can be argued. But Paul had sort of pioneered this anti-Torah, pro-Gentile, pro-peace form of Messianic Judaism. And come on, Paul first persecutes the Jesus movement, then he infiltrates the Jesus movement, and then he has hardcore arguments with its leaders about what Jesus really was all about. Right. No, it seems to me that Paul was throughout doing the same thing. He's trying to change the Jesus movement. And in fact, he does. And the heated arguments he has with James and Cephas in Galatians reveals that he's actually making some aggressive steps in changing the Jesus movement. So afterwards, if you're a pro-Roman, and there's another thing, Gentiles were interested in monotheism too. There were many Romans loved foreign religions. There were fads of foreign religions. this Pauline Christianity, the first indication we have of numbers about Pauline Christianity comes from really our first reference by any pagan writer, Pliny the Younger. He's the governor of Bithynia in modern day Turkey, and he's writing to the emperor Trajan around the year 111 or 112. And he's saying, what do we do about these Christians?
Mhm.
And it's clear he's talking about our Christians because he says they come from all classes of Romans, and he uses the term Christian. And he says this movement sort of peaked out 20 years before he wrote. That would make it around 91, 92 of the first century. So consistent with my theory, it's during the Flavian dynasty that this new Christianity is sort of reaching a peak in vogue.
Okay. So, but
I was gonna say, go ahead and respond and take your time and walk it out.
So, I guess here's the concern I have. If what we have is we have a Roman government deciding that they want to influence the Jews, and they want to influence the Jews because of there's this Jesus movement. The Jesus movement seems like a really unlikely candidate to me, particularly because what we have is you have a really, really obscure Jewish movement with maybe at best a few thousand followers in the first century, in an empire where there are millions of people, and where you have a large number of Jews. It seems like the more beneficial, and it seems like the easier explanation or the better method would have been for the Romans who decided to come up with this whole thing, would have been just to influence, or would have been to pick someone who wasn't as offensive. And I heard you lay out several things that would have been offensive to Jews to hear. For example, the idea that you, on your interpretation, not rebel. I don't take that interpretation, but and I don't think the majority of the Christian church has. Historically, I do think that there's an argument that largely in Western American Christianity it has. But that's as an aside. That they would not have decided to approve certain things that would have been most offensive to Jews, particularly, like, for example, the idea that you would have a man god would have been something that would have been offensive to Jews, and it would have just been really, really poor planning on their part to pick something that would have mirrored so well what I think, in a lot of ways, the imperial cult. And
That's
so,
it.
Yeah,
that's it. It's mirroring the imperial cult. It's getting
Right.
Jews conditioned to believe in a man god.
right. But
So it's moving them a step in the direction of pro-Roman, not fully, but it's moving them in the direction of Roman
Yeah.
state religion.
yeah. So I get the argument, but
In
however,
fact, it's going down a checklist of things that the Romans would object to in Judaism, starting with rebellion, Torah orthodoxy, separatism, militancy, and more than that, Tacitus tells us about something that happened in 64. The next major reference by a pagan historian during the 2nd century, after Pliny's letter to the emperor, is Tacitus's actual history. In the Annals, he tells us that in 64, the Jesus movement was blamed by Nero for the Great Fire of Rome.
Mhm.
And he's writing in around 120 AD. So about 60 years later, he's telling us that that Nero executed a whole bunch of Jesus movement followers. Now, if what you're saying is true, that the Jesus movement was that obscure, they could not have made a reasonable scapegoat for Nero. No, but if they were Jewish rebels, as I say they are, they would not only make good scapegoats, but there'd be a larger movement. The rebellion, it would be the larger movement. So Jesus was part of a much bigger movement, only it was a violent or orthodox movement. The Gospels have changed Jesus into something different. And it changed it by going right down the checklist of everything the Romans objected to in Messianic Judaism of the period.
Right. So then, on your view, then this was just really poor planning by the Romans because they would have pitched something from an obscure group that was most offensive to the Jews that historically they rebelled against repeatedly.
No, they're taking a major figure from a major rebel movement, the Jesus movement, well known to people. I mean, Tacitus says Nero blamed the Jesus movement for the Great Fire.
Well, what I mean is that what I mean is
30
that,
years after the crucifixion, are there enough Christians in Rome? The Gospels haven't even been written yet.
well,
And
no,
no, so what he's blaming is the rebels. And who would be a good likely suspect for the arson in Rome? Remember, violence in Rome had caused the Claudius, Nero's predecessor, to evict all the Jews from Rome 14 years before the fire.
Well,
So we know
what I mean is this.
Among Messianic Jews.
Well, here's what I mean. Failure in the respect that what you have is a failure to convert Jews or get them to do any of that stuff. Because as I'm sure you'll agree, you had a small number of Jews, and even today, presently, Jews represent a very small number in Christianity. And among Jews, it was abject failure, whereas among the Gentiles...
I can't see. It's a hard thing for us to measure.
Real quick, Jim.
Go ahead.
Let's let Slim finish his thought, and then I want you to respond. Go finish your thought, Slim, because then I want to get to vocab.
The percentage of Jews in the Roman Empire was 10 or 15%. Mm-hmm. Today, the Jewish population in America is 2.4%, mm-hmm. whereas the African American population is between 12 and 13% by the best estimates. Mm-hmm. So in the Roman Empire, there was a huge percentage of Jews, and they were all around the empire from Rome and Alexandria. So rabbinic Judaism, the kind of Judaism that replaced old Judaism, was also founded, like Christianity, at about this time. Mm-hmm. Only it had a different view of Messiah too. Correct. So the Messianic Jews so the Jews either appear to have lost the intense view of Messiah, or Messianic Jews became Christians. So I can't tell you that it was a failure. In fact, it's hard to measure its success among Jews. It's true that very quickly it became dominated by Gentile converts. Mm-hmm. And so Gentiles were, and it was never, Christianity was, this pro-Roman form of Jewish messianism was never aimed at everybody. It was only aimed either at Jews or those interested in Judaism or something like it. And there were a number of God-fearers. Gentiles wanted to be converted to Judaism, but didn't want to take that last step of circumcision. Adult males getting circumcised is a hard sell. And so it's clear to me that, let's put it this way, those who remained true to Torah had a real hard time sticking with a political Messiah. And they quickly spiritualized their Messiah and de-emphasized Messiah in rabbinic Judaism as a result of the Jewish wars. And so it's really hard for me to say what the impact was at first. It's plain that there were a bunch of Jewish converts early on, and these come from the Messianic movement. So there's also the use of the religion by the Romans. The Romans aren't dismissing every religion out of hand. They're saying it's on their side. And if they can get that religion to say it's on their side, all the better. Religion and politics are inseparable in people's minds. The gods must be favoring Roman. Is it?
Let's let Slim Reaper respond.
Yes, I'll say this, and I know you got so Jim. Thank you for your responses, and I see we got the mighty vocab Malone in here, so I'll be brief. I'll just say so. It seems to me that, and I've seen estimates from McMullen, Rodney Stark, and several others who've estimated the number of just Christians themselves in the whole Roman Empire, and then if Jews themselves were a small subset of that number, that it would have been really, really poor planning at whatever the time that the Romans would have approved documents, things like that, because you have an obscure group among the Jews in a small percentage anyhow. And then the largest successes came historically, and even today, the same thing is true because Christianity is so offensive to Jews. Among non-Jews, that you had the largest successes there. And so if the Romans were going to decide to create someone, it seems like the least likely thing that they would do was create a system that would be most offensive to the people they're talking about, as opposed to coming in and deciding to co-opt something. But when you introduce ideas that are so offensive to the Jews, that are so counter to Torah,
why do you have so many Jewish converts from the period?
I'm sorry?
Why do we have Jewish converts and in significant numbers?
Well, you have some Jewish converts.
Like I say, it looks like our population of Jews dramatically shrinks over time within the Roman Empire. Some of them were converted. But in any event, the Jews had a psychological and spiritual crisis. There was also a practical matter. Jerusalem is destroyed. After the Second War, Jews are expelled from Judea. Mm-hmm. And yet Christian bishops are allowed to be appointed by the Emperor Hadrian, by the way. But in any event, the point is there's a religious crisis in the minds of Jews who believe in an afterlife. and two of the three main segments of Jews at the time did. When the temple goes, we don't have the animal sacrifices that propitiate God required under Mosaic law. We don't have the Yom Kippur plea for the forgiveness of the sins of people. Without the temple, which is sort of a salvation mechanism, a machine, without that salvation machine called the temple, we need a whole new mechanism for salvation. And that's exactly what Jesus provides. And so there's a psychological crisis.
Let's let him finish his thought uninterrupted so we can get the vocab.
Yes, sir, Mr. James. So, Jim, I understand the claim, but again, it is, and as a historian, I think you'll agree that if that was the idea of the Roman government, then it was an abject failure on the part of the Roman government.
Well, I don't see that at all. I think it was a huge success. In fact, a bigger success than they ever planned.
No,
the whole empire.
Among Jews.
Let's let him finish.
Okay.
We're gonna let you respond, Jim.
Yes. Here's the thing. Success as a religion, which religions grow according to Stark and others at an average rate of about 40%. But this wasn't the case. It didn't have this rate among Jews, though. And so if the Roman governments were trying to get Jews to stop with their revolt and their rebellion, it was a failure in that respect.
Well, we certainly have thousands of Christians by the end.
Let's let him finish, and we're gonna go right back to you.
Again, Jim, I understand the claim, but if you're going to propose that among this growth of Christians was there, you can't likewise claim that we don't know the success among the Jews. So either you know that these Jews were brought into this Christian number, or we don't. But again, from the estimates, and even from today, even today, the Christian message is offensive to Jews. But after this, Mr. Jim, I'd love to dialogue with you further in the future. You come on and
sure.
And respond.
Sure. There's two things that I distinguish, though. One is the motive, and the other is the success. The fact that there was a motive to do this is obvious. We can see that the Romans were using Jewish messianic religion in their propaganda. That's just happening. It's called Josephus. It's called the Flavian Claims and so forth. By the end of the 2nd century, we have thousands of Christians just in the Roman army. But they're in the Marcus Aurelius in his column is showing the Christian unit that is praised in that archaeological evidence. The earliest physical evidence we have of Christianity is the tombs, is the catacombs of Christians in Rome. The oldest of these are the catacombs of St. Domitilla, which date from the early 2nd century.
Right.
And in the 2nd century, we're getting such a development of the literature that we can see that it's really picking up among Gentiles. It's true mostly, but that doesn't mean that there aren't many Jewish converts. There are, and there continue to be. In the 2nd century, for example, we have Hegesippus, a former Jew, an important Christian writer, former Jewish person. So why did Hegesippus get converted?
The argument that there were no Jewish converts, the argument is that when you're saying that this was created as a system to keep the Jews in check, I'm telling you there's an abject failure in respect of keeping Jews down. If you already have Romans who are converting, who already are part of the Roman system, Greco-Romans, and that's people already familiar with the ways and customs of Rome. These are already people who weren't rebelling. If the idea was to keep the Jews from rebelling, I'm trying to see what the success was of that, and that's
very hard to measure. We do know that by the beginning of the 2nd century, there are large numbers of Christians, and as Pliny the Elder, Pliny the Younger says in his letter, it became really popular by about 20 years after the Jewish War and the destruction of the temple, and that all classes of Romans were getting into it. So I think it had a broad appeal. I think there were Gentiles who wanted to worship. There were multiple motives here too. There were Gentiles who wanted to be Jewish, but they didn't want to have all the bells and whistles. And more than that, there were Jews who, like the Herods and Josephus, who would have found Christianity very friendly because they're pro-Roman Jews. That was part of the motive. As I say, you also have slaves, messianic, ex-violent rebels who are now slaves. And those people can be easily more addressed than, say, continued rebels out there. But notice what happens within Judaism itself. Rabbinic Judaism basically changes its whole perspective on Messiah. So the Romans were utterly successful in terms of changing Judaism. The Messianic Jews who continued in Messiah thought became Christians. Those who were not so wedded to a political messiah could continue being Torah Orthodox.
Appreciate your time, Jim.
All right, we got my brother, your brother, the infamous Vocab Malone. Now, I know y'all have a little bit of history, so I'm going to ask both ahead of time to please respect one another, respect me, allow the other party to finish their statement, and then we will get to you and allow you to respond. Please. And so, Vocab, what's your question for Mr. Valliant?
Yeah, it's based upon some things that Jim said from Tacitus. So, DMG, would it be okay if I read the passage from Tacitus?
Absolutely.
Okay, so we'll see if it matches up with what's been said here. This is in the Annals 1544, and here's what it says. Consequently, to get rid of the report, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. Before we go any further, it's important to understand he gives the reason, in part, for this action. They were hated by the populace for their abominations. So it doesn't have to be, oh, these are Jewish terrorists, these aren't Christians or anything like that, because Tacitus is telling us, but he's going to tell us more. So look to here, called Christians by the populace. Now he's going to give a little bio on the origin as best he can. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of her procurators. So that's referring to crucifixion. I recommend Martin Hingel's excellent book on the topic. It's a monograph based upon some lectures. Continuing on, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of her procurators, Pontius Pilate, and a most mischievous superstition. So notice how Tacitus is referring to the Christians.
Yeah.
He's referring to their founder. He's referring to it as a class hated because of their abominations, refers to it as a mischievous superstition. Thus checked for the moment. So it's interesting. Why would it be checked? Well, because of the death of the founder. Continuing on, again broke out not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome, where all things hideous and shameful from every part of the world find their center and become popular. So he's calling this belief system hideous, shameful as well. Accordingly, an arrest was first made of all who pleaded guilty. Then upon their information, an immense multitude was convicted. And this is really key. Listen to this, everyone, from Tacitus. Not so much of the crime of firing the city as of hatred against mankind.
Right.
So this is important to understand.
Yes.
Because you see that it doesn't have to be that they actually thought that they did this or anything like that. It says, this is the problem. And then last paragraph, there's more that he talks about here, but the last paragraph I'll read out of this. Mockery of every sort was added to their deaths. Covered with the skins of beasts, they were torn by dogs and perished, or were nailed to crosses, or were doomed to the flames and burnt to serve as a nightly illumination when daylight had expired. Now, the key thing there is to just point out that he gives the origin there in Judea. He gives some historical background about the founder. He gives a description of them, shows that they're disliked among the population. All of this. So when we read Tacitus, we can see who he's describing. It's clear and obvious. They're Christians who follow Jesus, who was crucified. There really is not about that. I've read a number of works on Tacitus.
I totally agree.
But you're trying to tell us that it's something else.
No.
Because you're saying, well, why would it be Christians? This is the zealous. This is the zealous
right.
sect.
Yeah. The term Christian didn't even exist, I think, in 64. It's certainly not attested in anything written, not the letters of Paul, not really even in the New Testament. So the term Christian,
it's in four places. It's in Acts and it's in Peter.
Okay, that's a later thing.
Well, that's what you're saying, but it is in Acts.
But let's look at
You said not even in the New Testament. Remember,
he's using a term that pagans haven't used yet until, like I say, Josephus, Pliny, and Tacitus. So the term Christian is you at least have to be open-minded to it. Now, Nero is who Tacitus says set the fire. Most historians reject.
No, that's.
Are you done?
Yeah, that's.
Yeah, now you're done. Okay.
Well, I just.
Okay.
Don't start.
Finish.
Don't start doing that, because this is the problem last time.
That's right. You're
interrupting.
the
problem last time.
That's right. You're interrupting.
So what I perceive is you don't like to be challenged. All I'm trying to do is to show people to read,
interrupted.
To read the source for themselves. That's all I'm doing.
Please do. Please
That's what
do.
we're doing.
Let's let vocab finish, so he can respond.
So you just insulted me. I love being challenged. So don't talk about me. Let's stick to the subject, and I'll avoid talking about you. Okay?
So you're willing to debate then? You said you love being challenged.
No, we're debating now. Apparently, you just keep off of personalities and stick to the subject.
Vocab. Let me ask you this: Would you be willing to have a moderated dialogue versus?
Absolutely.
Well, let's see how he does here.
I guess that's dialogue.
Well, let's see how he failed the night. No one has to put up.
Let's let him
the other night. No one should have to put up with that crap.
Let's let him finish his thought, and then I want to make sure he can respond.
I want to point out, when you read the passage in its context, your theory is not to be found anywhere in passages, this description of this group. It's not to be found in any scholar of classics. Your theory is not to be found by anybody who knows Tacitus well, who reads Latin. Your theory is not to be found anywhere when we look at the Roman historians. And so you have a major problem. You're not really interpreting this passage right, because you're trying to say, oh, it's this other group. You're separating it out, but that's not the case. We read what it said. We see who the founder is, and we see what the problem is. And it said nothing about them being violent revolutionaries or Jewish radicals. It said nothing like that. And that's what you're trying to get us to believe, though.
Let me know when you're done. Is that done?
You ready for him to respond?
Yes.
Okay, that means no more until I'm done, okay? We're told specifically that these are rebels. We're told they're hated by mankind and that some of them faced crucifixion, which is the punishment for rebels. That's why we know Jesus, for example, to have been a rebel. Jesus was part of a rebel movement. Many scholars have argued that Jesus is a rebel. Professor Brandon in the 60s, more recently Reza Aslan, the bestseller, the idea of Jesus being a zealot or part of a zealot movement. Many scholars have, in fact, addressed and supported. Professor Eisenman, Professor Brandon. So you were just wrong there.
I'm looking for the word rebel. I don't see it.
Okay. See, if this happens, I cannot debate. I need to have the same chance he did.
I don't see the word rebel anywhere in here.
Let him finish. Let him finish his thought, vocab.
But it doesn't say that.
Just let him finish, and then we're gonna get back to you so you can respond.
Like I say, what we do know is crucifixion is for a certain crime. Thieves are strangled. Most executions are beheadings. When you someone gets crucified, it's because they're a rebel. That's why Jesus was crucified, because he was claiming to be the king of the Jews, a rebel. So if some of them were crucified and deserved their punishment and were thought of as haters of mankind by the Romans, now, most historians also reject, at this point, many historians at least, reject the idea of Nero being the likely setter of the fire. It caused him probably, I'll call it, kinds of trouble. In fact, it may have eventually resulted in his demise 4 years later. But it certainly was just 2 years before the outbreak of war in Judea. Just 2 years. And 14 years after the violence among Jews in Rome under a Chrestus, stimulated by Chrestus, according to Suetonius. So there were Chrestus-type violent revolutionaries, according to Suetonius, who were expelled from Rome 14 years before the Great Fire. So, in my view, Jewish rebels are most likely to be the perpetrators of the arson. We have, according to Tacitus' confessions, furthermore, we have Jewish rebels engaged in arson elsewhere, such as Antioch. So, given the general tenor of terrorism and violence from Jewish messianics, it doesn't take a genius to figure out that what Nero is doing is blaming the Jewish messianics who would be at open war just 2 years later, or who had to be expelled from Rome because of Chrestus disturbances 14 years before, are deserving of this punishment. Tacitus seems to straightforward. He doesn't call Jesus a pacifist. He doesn't say these guys are pacifists. He uses a contemporary, in fact, in the manuscripts, the term is Christiani that Tacitus uses, and Chrestus, just like the Chrestus term Suetonius uses about the guy who stimulated violence 14 years earlier, causing Claudius to expel all the Jews from the city of Rome. That was a Chrestus disturbance, according to Suetonius. So these Roman historians like Suetonius and Tacitus are calling Chrestus and Christiani rebel-type figures, if anything. And that's what would make sense. There would not be enough, as was pointed out earlier, there was certainly not enough pacifist Pauline Christians. We don't even have the Gospels written yet. But we certainly don't have enough pacifist Pauline Christians in Rome to make a credible scapegoat. No, make a credible scapegoat, for the Tacitus's report to be at all historically accurate, it must be a wider movement, a bigger movement, that could, within 30 years of the crucifixion, make a credible scapegoat. There's not enough Pauline pacifist Christians in Rome by 64 that were even known of. No, it had to be the Jewish rebels that he's talking about. And they make a much more likely suspect for the crime itself of the arson. Certainly a better scapegoat. The rebels, a real big movement that could credibly be blamed for the fire of Rome, which is what Tacitus is telling us about, not some obscure Jesus movement. With a pacifist that wouldn't even make good scapegoats anyway.
All right, vocab. It's
and
on you.
Yet it says Jesus. That's who it's referring to.
Right. Jesus is a rebel.
Go, let him go.
I want to point out here's what I want everyone to realize. So when Jim tells you something from a source, whether it's the Bible, whether it's Tacitus, whether it's Suetonius, whether it's Pliny the Younger, basically, you can take it as a given that you can never trust his reporting of what the source actually said.
I'm done. You're calling me a liar. You're lying right now. Right now, sir. I don't put up with this crap. Please get him out. I'm gone. It's him or me.
Now, I thought that you said you could go and then I could go. Why are you so emotional?
Insults. Everything was accurate. I'm not talking to this liar anymore. This personal insulter who needs to personally insult people. You lose the argument when you talk personalities, dude.
You've lost your temper there. I see. You're turning red.
Your ridiculous irrationality.
Whose side you on?
Jim, let me
if I could just finish what I was saying, I'll let you finish.
I'm not going to put up with this crap.
Hold on, vocab. Jim, let me ask you a question.
Everything that guy said is a lie, including the last thing he said.
I guess I should freak out now too and throw a fit.
What did he say? What did he say exactly that you?
Everything I say, every time I quote someone, it's a lie. It's inaccurate. You can't trust it. He's calling me a liar. I'm done. The conversation with that guy is over.
So I'll give you examples of what I was saying here.
Well, I leave. He continues to talk. I leave.
You said they were called rebels, right? But they're not called rebels there. They weren't called rebels in Annals 15. The word doesn't exist. They're not called rebels. That was the first thing. Secondly, when we go to Suetonius and we see what Suetonius says, you also didn't get that right either. It doesn't say that they were violent revolutionaries and got expelled because they were violent revolutionaries. Claudius 25 in Suetonius. Just let me finish the sentence. It says, since the Jews
get him back.
Since the Jews constantly made disturbances at the instigation of Chrestus, he expelled them from Rome. This man said, because they were violent revolutionaries. The text says nothing about them being violent revolutionaries. So the reason why I said that whenever he gives you a source, I want you to understand. Here's something I've learned about Jim. He doesn't show slides when he speaks. He doesn't read from the books when he speaks. He paraphrases the source in his own words, and he literally adds a gloss or a glaze of his theory on top of what the actual words are. It is dishonest. So all I was doing was encouraging everybody to always check out every source that he cites and see if it says what he says. Because when you read Suetonius, you'll see, oh, it doesn't say violent revolutionaries. Now, I want to explain what that's the mark of, his tendency to operate that way. It's the mark of a few things, and it's very telling. Number one, it's the mark of a weak theory. If your theory is strong enough to stand on its own two, you don't have to fudge data in order to prop your theory up. Since Jim, I think, is fully aware at the anemic nature of his Flavian hypothesis, he props it up by adding Jim Valliant glosses to every source he cites as if what is being said there is in his favor. It is not. He got showed that once while he was on the panel, and if he wouldn't have ran, he would have been shown this twice in regards to Suetonius. We could do this further because earlier in the conversation, he said, Paul said it's a sin to rebel.
Yeah, Vocab, I was going to ask you about that.
Paul never said it's a sin to rebel.
Yeah,
he never said such a thing. Say what?
Doesn't he say it's a sin to rebel in Romans 13? Haven't you read that?
Yeah, I read Romans 13.
Yeah, it says it's a sin to rebel there, right?
Show me the phrase.
No, I'm just messing you, man.
Because it doesn't say that. It doesn't say that. In
fact, how about the point in time where where Jesus says it's a sin to charge interest?
What? I don't. I'm sorry, you lost me on how that's relevant.
Well, this was a claim Jim made as well. He said that Jesus says it's a sin to charge interest on loans.
I don't think Jesus said that.
Okay, and yeah, and then so there was a couple of things I had a question about, because like you said, it says a rebellion is a sin. I've read Romans 13 a number of occasions.
Romans 13, it doesn't say that it's a sin to rebel, and every time he's referencing a source, he's almost always getting it wrong. But he's doing it, it's not accidental, because we all make mistakes on words. And if you tell someone I'm paraphrasing or this is a loose quote, that's understandable. We all do that, right? But if you're phrasing it in a way that gives implicit credence to your theory that you're promoting, and you're getting it wrong every time in favor of your theory being promoted in the quote that you're not quoting, that's the sign of a weak theory, number one. Number two, it's also the sign of somebody who does not either practice, for whatever reason, someone who doesn't practice good scholarship. It's a sign of lack of attention to detail, lack of precision, lack of subtlety, lack of nuance, lack of truly laying out a case according to the facts. So it's not a good way to do it with sort of generalities and vagaries and shading the data. And I reiterate, Suetonius never says it was because of violent rebels. He never says anything like that, or violent instigators. He never says anything like that. In fact, in Acts, and by the way, this is confirmation. It's interesting. Within the ancient world, the only two places we have the expulsion of the Jews mentioned is in Suetonius, and it's in Acts. Tacitus doesn't mention it, and neither do any of the other Greco-Roman folks. Not even Josephus. You would think he would mention it. They don't mention it. Only Suetonius mentions it. And this, by the way, shows that arguments for silence are problematic, because here you have a major event that you would think someone like Tacitus, Josephus would care about, but they don't mention it. That's just the nature of history. It's selective. Suetonius mentions the expulsion of the Jews under Claudius in 49 AD. Acts, Luke does as well. And if you notice, some of the people that came back, they were good folk. They weren't crazy. They were good folk. Husband and wife couple. They were good folk. So it shows that he's not careful. He's not precise, despite the fact that he gives the air of I'm doing scholarly research. And it shows that his theory is weak because it needs to be propped up. And it might even show the mark of somebody who's dishonest. And I think maybe by his reaction, maybe that's what we're seeing, because Jim is not really used to being challenged, even in a mild way or a meek way. And that's what you get. You would think a man that season of that experience would be able to handle some basic pushback. I mean, my understanding is he's argued before judges as in situations regarding the law, and he can't just handle this. So we have a lot of problems. And one other thing I'll mention is he tried to say that the you don't have the Romans being blamed. You know, it's just Jews getting blamed in the New Testament. And here's the last thing I'll say, and then I'll.
All right, bro. Yeah. After this, I'm gonna let y'all clear out, and I'm gonna get Jim back in here so he can get the last word.
Okay. Wow. All right.
So I don't think I'm gonna be able to put that conversation together after all. I might be able to get it with you, Slim, but vocab, it's not gonna happen. But
yeah, I see that. But notice, you know, he's like telling me, hey, you need to be quiet. You need to be quiet. Are you done talking? And then when I speak, he loses it, you know, right, like real fast. And all I said was you can't trust when he cites a source, so you should check on it yourself, which is pretty standard, by the way. Look at Acts chapter 4.
Have more attention than I anticipated, but yeah, go ahead and finish up, and I'm gonna get Jim back in.
Acts 4:27 says this: truly in this city, and this is the early believers here, they're praying. This is in Acts 4:27. Truly in this city, there were gathered together against your holy servant Jesus, whom you anointed, both Herod and Pontius Pilate, along with the Gentiles and the peoples of Israel, to do whatever your hand and your plan had predestined to take place. So what's the discussion there? Well, they're talking about what happened to Jesus, the crucifixion. So how is this pro-Roman document that just excoriates and blames Jews and excuses Romans when you have, and this is not the only place, by the way, it says it right here. You got Pontius Pilate and along with the Gentiles. So that's just one. We could give multiple other places. It's just not the case. So just like where he said Christian is not in the New Testament, when I cited a place, he said, well, that's later. Well, okay, you could say it's later, but it's still in the New Testament. The word Christian is in the New Testament.
Well, listen, keep listening, because Jim is coming back, and like I said, he got the last word, so I'm gonna let him respond. Maybe I can get y'all to do responses where y'all not necessarily on the same show. That way, the tension won't be overload. But
if we had a time debate, like if you watch the debate I did,
no, I'm not going to be appearing with him. Remove him, or I'm gone.
Let me let you go so he can
get rid of this vocab figure.
I'll get with you. Let me let him finish out, and we'll talk.
I'll let you go.
I'm gone. I'm not going to listen to his lies anymore.
You can cut me out. It's okay. Go ahead.
Yeah, go. Get out of here. This is not. Go.
He
please remove him now. Where I go.
You want me to deal with Grandpa Baby there?
Yeah. Peace. Okay, well, I'm going to tell you something. I do not allow. I'm too old to put up with that crap. Being called a liar when he couldn't point out a single thing I said wrong. He didn't point out a single falsehood. I agreed with his quotation from Tacitus to the word, and so he's just making crap up and insulting me. I don't have to put up with that. No one has to put up with insults. There's no reason to leave the subject to talk about the person you're debating with. It's called ad hominem. It's a fallacy. It's a logical. It's not only a logical fallacy. It's offensive. It's insulting, and it is. In any case, I will not put up with that. There's no reason ever to discuss the person you're debating with. Just the topic. The person.
I didn't realize that the tension
back to what he was
saying was so intense. So I thought we were actually going to be able to put that together, but I can see it would never be able to.
No, because he's not an intellectually honest person because that's a Christian. Is that Christianity in action? Did we just witness judge not and forgive and love with me? No. In any case, he's cosmically ignorant of the Roman worldview, which believed that everything was determined by God. everything was determined by God. The Stoics believed just that all the powers of the earth, and he quotes Romans being critical of other Romans. The reason why we know, for example, that Caligula is such a horrible guy or Nero's a bad guy is from pagan Roman senator historians like Tacitus and Suetonius, not from Jews or Christians. It's other pagan Romans criticize. Oh, and how do we know that Herod the Great was such a rotten guy? It's Josephus, the Jewish historian, who's telling us. So the vocab has a one-dimensional, simplistic view of history and humanity, but he also has a pretty cosmic ignorance of Roman religion. Christianity is, when it says stuff like he was quoting from Acts, is sounding much more like Stoic Roman philosophy than it is anything else. Everyone is ruled, all the rulers, the emperor, all of us, good, bad, and ugly. We're all determined we're under the rule of God. Stoic would say that. He acts as though Christianity invented that wheel. It did not. In any case, now that we've cleared out that, I just want to say,
were you able to hear any of the information that he put out while you were still in the back?
Just the last little bit there.
You want to respond to that?
And I would just repeat what I said. He seems to think that when the Bible says that God is in control of everything, including the emperor, that's anti-Roman. Roman emperors would say the same thing. God is in control. And by the way, in Rome during the first century, it's not appropriate to call the emperor a living god. They were not living gods. In fact, there were only two emperors who were tried to claim to be living gods as emperors. That's Caligula and Domitian. They were deified after their lives, if they were successful, in the city of Rome. In the Eastern Mediterranean, they were often worshipped in their lifetime as gods, where people were used to worshiping their kings and pharaohs as gods. And this is part and parcel of that same sort of Roman strategy of integrating themselves with those local deities. But the only part I heard him say was what I heard him, in effect, echo when he was talking with Jacob the other night, is that what Roman would say that the Jewish God is in control of everything. Well, it's only taking the Stoic God, but they're kind of pantheists. Most Stoics have a variety of views on this, but some of them are pantheists. Some of them believe that it's like a demiurge in a Platonic sense that's intelligently shaping and moving history. But history is the inevitable playing out of fate. That's the most famous idea of the Stoics. Anyone who knows anything about Stoicism knows that the sort of stuff he was quoting from Acts is classic Stoicism, Roman philosophy. It's that crazy. I mean, he's putting it off as though it's duh. No, as if Christians invented this idea of an all-powerful God who controls fate and destiny. No, everything's been preordained by the Stoic God. All the rulers of the world are under the dominion of the Stoic God.
So how do you feel about or what how I guess I should say, how does your assertion sort of play into what he was saying about what Tacitus wrote and about Nero and things of that nature, because you didn't really get to explain that fully.
Yeah, this is in fact the first mention by outside of Josephus and Christian literature, the first reference to Jesus at all by a historian. There is no first century physical evidence of Jesus, unfortunately, maybe apart from the Talpiot tomb. And that's really interesting. That's one of the things that may cause me to really be a historicist. But apart from that physical evidence, potential physical evidence of Jesus, really we only have like the texts of the authentic Pauline letters. There's a debate over Josephus, the Jewish historian, as to whether he mentioned Jesus in the testimony. Most historians think he did. And that it was tampered with by later Christians to make it seem more Christian. As far as I'm concerned, it sounds like it's original to me. And I'm certain that the earlier mention of Jesus in Josephus, the James passage, is authentic. But we have Josephus who mentions Jesus, and we have Christian literature. But outside of that, that's the first century. Tacitus is the first pagan historian to mention Jesus at all. And he mentions him in this context. Nero blaming the great fire of Rome on Christians. He begins at midstream. He said, his quotation, Tacitus has just blamed Nero for destroying his own capital. A lot of historians doubt the credibility of that. Who would destroy their own capital? It was very expensive for him. It caused political problems for him. It wasn't cheap. And when he fixed Rome, he fixed it to be fire safe so that it wouldn't happen again. And so a lot of historians have looked back and said, no, Nero, Tacitus is blaming Nero. Now, who's anti-Nero? Well, it's the Flavians who come afterwards. They're probably the people who spread this anti-Nero propaganda that gets picked up by Roman historians, anti-Christian Roman historians like Tacitus. But to be a credible, I think Tacitus is telling us a credible thing. Rome was destroyed by fire in 64. Nero is not likely the person who did it, however. He did blame Jewish Messianics. Jewish Messianics were the most violent group in the empire at the time. This was just 2 years before the Jewish War began. So violent Jewish Messianics would make a very good scapegoat for Nero, wouldn't they? So if Tacitus is telling us the truth, then who Nero blamed were Messianic Jews. In fact, Tacitus says it. Everyone hated these people. For everyone to know about these people means they're the rebels. This obscure little Jesus movement wouldn't be known and hated by everyone already. Tacitus, as he explains, these people are already hated. And for being rebels, you see, it's not just this fire. They're haters of all mankind like these separatist Jews are. So the most credible way of reading Tacitus is that when the fire actually happened, which we know actually happened, we can archaeologically even confirm the Great Fire of Rome in 64. Tacitus is probably reporting correctly that Nero was found either the true culprits, the Jewish rebels. Would it surprise you if the Jewish rebels set fire to Rome? They not only make a credible scapegoat, they make a credible perp. We know that Jewish rebels started arson elsewhere. In fact, there was all kinds of Jewish messianic violence throughout the first century. They made a credible perp for arson. Anywhere in Antioch, we're told that they engaged in arson. Okay, so the Jewish messianics were violent and made a credible scapegoat, and they were hated already, just as Tacitus says. And the punishment for traitors is crucifixion. So when they're crucified, we're being told something very specific. They're political traitors. They're rebels.
Wow. So part of your theory is that the historical followers of Christ were not at all pacifists. That they were
initially, no. I think they're rebels. I think that many of them started to rethink the whole thing when Jesus was crucified. If this is to be the earthly king and he got crucified, this is going to set off some thinking here. We expected him to be the earthly king. We expected him to kick Roman butt and to give us an independent Israel, if not conquer the whole world, like Isaiah says. And so we need to, if Jesus was our man, then we maybe need to rethink the Messiah. So rethinking of the Messiah itself may have begun in the Jesus movement at the crucifixion. But when we're talking about James getting executed in the 60s, for example, 62, Josephus tells us, he's the leader of a large movement. The Sanhedrin want him dead, and they take advantage of the Roman governor being absent in order to have James and several others stoned. But the Romans are so sensitive to that execution, they remove the high priest. That suggests a very important movement. That suggests a movement Josephus is noticing, right? And the execution of James he's noticing, and that the Sanhedrin and the governor know, and boy, the heads are rolling when James is killed, but they want James and others dead. And that suggests to me that the Sanhedrin, who are cooperating with Rome and trying to keep a lid on the Jewish rebels, that James is a rebel. Who else is the Sanhedrin opposed to? But these Jewish rebels. The Sanhedrin is pro-Roman. So if the Sanhedrin's going after you, like they went after Jesus and Stephen and James, you're likely to be one of these Jewish rebels. Why else would the Sanhedrin be going after you? Religious innovations? Why, there are all kinds of sects of Jews. Did they go after the Essenes because they believed in ultra-baptism? Or some of them were celibates? No. No, if there was some slight theological difference among Jewish sects, they're not going to go crucify you. No, the Sanhedrin crucified Jesus and stoned James because they were rebels.
So now, what do you make of like the Mishnah and the Talmud, and what I thought, or what I think is another mention of Jesus, except for the method in which he is executed is different. But it does mention that he has disciples, although not as many as what we were told in the New Testament. He's stoned instead of crucified, but it does acknowledge the miracles. It chalks them up to witchcraft. What do you make of those in context of your theory and how that fits in, or does it even factor in?
The Talmud and Kelsis, there's an interesting story about Jesus, that he's the son of a Roman soldier. Now, of course, that I think is mockery of the virgin birth story. So I think it's a post-virgin birth story to even say that. But what an interesting sort of suggestion that it's a Roman soldier, a Roman military guy who's the father of Jesus. It's as if they're even almost subconsciously aware.
That's why I asked, in light of theory. That's why I asked.
But the other thing is that there were a bunch of people. There were Jewish miracle men walking around all the place in this time. Josephus tells us the story of an exorcism that took place long after Jesus, in the presence of the emperor and himself. A Jewish exorcist cast out demons right in front of the Emperor Vespasian. A Jewish exorcist cast out demons in front of the Emperor Vespasian. We got Simon Magus. We got, we've got one of the rebels, Josephus tells us, says he's going to part the Jordan River just like Joshua did in Hebrew literature when the Hebrews come into the promised land for the first time. He's going to reproduce the miracle of Joshua and part the Jordan River. So we have all kinds of rebel miracle men, Jewish messianic miracle men, and Jewish exorcists even. So miracles and sects are all over the place. So it wouldn't surprise me if there's many similar sorts of stories in the Talmud about men from this era before and after who maybe were executed in different ways for different reasons.
Gotcha. Yeah, that part about the Roman soldier for a father, just in light of your theory, that's why I was curious.
Yeah. Every time you keep pulling a string, it's weird how you keep coming up Roman, Roman influence. That's the creepy thing. Like I say, the very structure of the story of Jesus's trial and execution, most critical scholars recognize as fiction. There's no witnesses. So how did this common story shared by all four Gospels come into being, even though they couldn't have known the details like that? Well, look at the theme. It's like one of Jesus's parables, isn't it? The Jews kill Jesus, demand Jesus's death. In fact, like with the Barabbas story, they make it really clear. The Jews want a rebel released, and they want the pacifist Jesus killed. Now talk about making the point exquisitely clear, right? The rebels the Jews have a real clear choice: rebellion or peace, and they chose rebellion, and they crucified Jesus. They crucified Jesus, you see. And could Romans criticize previous Romans? Yeah, Romans didn't much like the way Pilate governed Rome or Judea as governor, right? Romans criticized. How do you know? Like I say, the dirt we know about Caligula and Nero come from pagan Roman historians, senators. The dirt we know about Herod the Great comes from Josephus, who's a Jewish historian working for the Romans. So a simplistic view of history is not going to help us here. We have to understand that the Flavians, for example, spread anti-Nero propaganda. So if you find anti-Nero propaganda, that doesn't necessarily mean it's anti-Roman propaganda.
So from a historical standpoint, I guess some of the things said about Nero may not be true in terms of his attributed to his evil deeds. I guess.
Well, let me put it this way: I just read the number of people that he bumped off because he thought they were a threat. The number of relatives and high-ranking Roman noblemen. He killed. And look at this. Now, I know Mom was a big oppressive influence. She was married to the previous emperor, and so she was a big influence in his first 5 years. The first 5 years of Nero's reign are called the good years. And that's when the philosopher Seneca and Mom were kind of running the show when he was a young emperor. Nero wants to get rid of the influence of Mom. And so in 59 AD, he kills his own mother. It takes him several times. He puts her in this ship that collapses. She swims to shore and survives. He has to send someone. People have to kill Mom. He has his first wife killed in a horrible way. He has most of his cousins killed in the subsequent years, and noblemen. There's a revolt after the Great Fire in 64. There's a revolt among the nobles called the Piso Conspiracy of 65, in which Seneca gets killed, Petronius, the author of the Satyricon. Now, so he was a tyrant, and I'm not going to bandy words about that. But, and are all the stories that we hear from Suetonius about these emperors true? No, Suetonius is telling us the kitchen guy. He's a Republican. He doesn't much like emperors in general. So he's going to give us all the kitchen gossip, all the dirt on the emperors. And he does, even the ones he likes. But like Titus gets nothing but praise. Well, the guy who sacked Jerusalem and destroyed the temple, Suetonius thinks he's, super duper, the greatest guy who ever lived as an emperor. For example, and he is the Jewish Messiah. Suetonius he was called the Jewish. No. Suetonius says, yes, the Jewish prophecy. This is the pagan historian Suetonius, similar with Tacitus. Tacitus says, yes, the fulfillment of Jewish prophecy was in Vespasian and Titus, who were the true messiahs. So you see here, there's Roman pagans saying Jewish prophecy is true.
Wow.
Only it was fulfilled by Roman emperors. So Romans are happy to use the Jewish religion and even believe it. And they don't say, Tacitus and Suetonius don't say Vespasian and Titus claimed to be the Jewish Messiah. They say, in all credulity, they were in fact the Messiah.
And I'm curious about two things. So it seemed like in the Julio-Claudian dynasty, I guess, what was it, Octavian? Is it Tiberius?
Augustus, Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, Nero.
And so the outliers are Caligula and Nero then.
Well, yeah, the worst, the baddies. Tiberius is, Tacitus gives us a detailed year-by-year account of Tiberius's reign in the annals, and he doesn't much like Tiberius because he believes that made the institution of emperor permanent. The second emperor, you see, we're now stuck with emperors. The republic's gone, and Tiberius's right-hand man, a guy named Aelius Sejanus, set up the Praetorian Guard and started charging people with political crimes, offenses against the dignity of the emperor. So you can't be critical of the emperor or you get prosecuted. Tacitus thought that was a negative turn in the history of the Republic. And so he tells all kinds of negative stories about Tiberius. So does Suetonius. Suetonius calls him a sexual pervert in all kinds of ways. Once Tiberius retires to the island of Capri, the island of Capri off the coast of Italy, beautiful place. He builds a villa on the island of the Mediterranean island of Capri, where the Emperor Tiberius lives. He's sort of living in exclusion, so a bunch of rumors about his behavior spread. So that people are he's engaged in all kinds of sexual antics there on Capri. So many historians have looked back and said Tacitus and Suetonius may be too harsh on even Tiberius, because they don't like, but he was a good administrator. He sure was. In some ways, historians have revived the reputation of Tiberius. And in many ways, a variety of historians have questioned the accuracy of Suetonius in all the dirt that he tells us about the emperors, because he's got a political axe to grind. And so Caligula, for example, was taken out within a few short years by his own Praetorian Guard, which indicates that he probably was going too far. There were things that he'd done that were wrong. But to call him a madman, some historians have said, well, maybe he was just a rash young man calling himself a living god. Well, pharaohs did, marrying his and deifying his sister. Well, Roman pharaohs did that too, or Egyptian pharaohs did that too. So was he modeling his new Roman emperorship on Egyptian pharaohs? They said he was considering moving the capital from Rome to Alexandria. So, and how better to diss the Senate than to appoint your horse to be a senator? So you could look at it in one way, he's crazy, he's bat guano crazy, or you could say he's really, dismissing the Senate, modeling his divine emperorship on the pharaohs.
He seemed like he may have just been a little petty, but
right.
Let me ask you this:
we have to use our own judgment, don't we?
Yeah, exactly. After the Flavians, did any according to your theory, did any other emperors or dynasties of emperors pick up on what they potentially started regarding Christianity?
Right. I do believe that it was the turn against Christians started officially within the Flavian dynasty. Vespasian and Titus were close to many Jews. We're told Titus almost married Berenike, the great-granddaughter of Herod the Great. But popular opinion at Rome called her a second Cleopatra and wouldn't have put up with the emperor marrying this Jewish princess. I mean, literally a Jewish princess. And so we were told that's how close Titus was with the Jewish figures in his court. But his brother Domitian becomes emperor, and he wasn't in Judea, and he couldn't claim the mantle of Jewish Messiah. And we're told he turned against people in his own family. We're told he turned against a cousin, Titus Flavius Clemens, specifically because he adopted Jewish ways. Now, there's a member of the imperial family adopting Jewish ways. Dio Cassius, the Roman historian, tells us this. Many people have interpreted this as him being converted to Christianity, or at least being a God-fearer. Now, that's how close Judaism is with the Flavian dynasty, but it appears that Domitian is turning on the Jewish elements in the Flavian court, as he has Clement executed, Josephus's patron, Epaphroditus, executed at the same time, because apparently they're involved in the coup against Domitian. So the first Christian persecution is traditionally under Domitian after Nero, and there's something to it. It could be based on these stories of the Jewish elements within the Flavian court being persecuted by the Emperor Domitian. So thereafter, it's an open question how we're going to deal with these Christians for Roman emperors. When the next big Jewish revolt breaks out under Hadrian, the Christian historian Eusebius tells us that when Jews were expelled from Judea, Hadrian allowed the appointment of Christian bishops in Jerusalem. Hadrian is officially sanctioning the appointment of Christian bishops. So by his time, the Flavians have been detached from the Jesus cult. Even the pro-Roman Jesus cult has been thoroughly detached from the Flavians, and it's being retooled for a whole new war during Hadrian.
Wow.
And thereafter, you have a mixed bag. You have an argument, Justin Martyr's famous argument in front of Antoninus Pius. But notice what Justin says. He actually seems to ask the emperor to help him persecute heretics. Wild. He compares Christianity to pagan religion. Very famously. Let me give you one of the most important Christian writers around the year 200 is a cat named Titus Flavius Clemens, the same exact name of the guy killed by Domitian more than 100 years ago for adopting Jewish ways, Titus Flavius Clemens. By the end of the 2nd century, there are so many Christians in the Roman army that they can appear on the column of Aurelius being praised for their efforts in conquering the world for the emperor Marcus Aurelius. So there must have been enough Christians who could pass Pliny the Younger's test and say prayers for the emperor. Yeah, it would be a condition of getting into the Roman army. And so there must have been thousands of Christians in the 2nd century who were perfectly willing to say prayers of the kind that Pliny required in his loyalty test. Otherwise, they couldn't get into the Roman army. And we know that by the year 200, there are thousands of Christians in the Roman army. Whole Christian units.
Interesting. So this will be my last question, because I gotta go load up on some medication.
Yes,
But what's your thoughts on Constantine and his conversion or non-conversion, and how that impacted Christianity going forward?
Well, as I was suggested earlier, by this point, there's two things to bear in mind. The Romans have changed their initial policy of, let's call it multiculturalism and tolerance, and now they're looking for a single faith, a single religion to unify, to culturally and politically unify their empire. And so there are various religions that are considered the most. Constantine, Sol Invictus, is actually the great competitor in this regard. It was to be a sort of monotheistic religion that would unify the whole empire. He, because I think of family connections that he had, he began to favor Christianity. And by the end of the 200s, by the end of the 3rd century, Christians were a real political constituency. It's not until the year 250 that you get any law against Christianity. By Decius, the first law against Christianity. And of course, you have Diocletian's famous persecution, which was a brief persecution. But it's really because they're a political, military constituency within the Roman Empire. Constantine cashes in on that constituency by first legalizing it and giving it official status. And look how easily Christianity fit into the Roman world, hand in glove. It's as if Christianity had been designed for the Roman Empire. And so it fits hand in glove. And by the end of his, I think by the end of his reign, it's pretty clear that most of his family have been well converted. And that dynasty, the Constantinian dynasty, which sort of brings Rome back for its last hurrah before the Western Empire falls, all but Justin Martyr within that family are advocates of Christianity. And so it's in the 4th century, in the dynasty of the Constantines, that Rome really becomes a Christian place. And the Bishop of Rome, as opposed to the emperor, now and continues to hold the title Pontifex Maximus. It used to be emperors, of course, and then the Bishop of Rome got the title Pontifex Maximus, but under the Constantines. And you'll notice the Roman Empire remained a holy institution. A holy Roman Empire existed until Napoleon, a little over 200 some years ago.
Wow. It's a lot of history that I feel like we are unaware of, or we just don't quite know as accurately as we could. And so I'm always interested to hear some of those tidbits. And so I definitely appreciate you coming on. I apologize for the snap.
I apologize for getting upset. And he was right. He ticked me off because I think that's unjust. I think it's not right. I think that the internet has created a degree of incivility where people can treat each other pretty rotten. And like I say, in a debate, I don't bring up the other guy. I hope he doesn't bring me up. We're not relevant. Let's stick to the subject. Let's talk the facts and the evidence. If you bring up the other guy, you're just making the situation ugly. And I think that we have to clean up our culture to some degree. And I don't believe in government forcing it. So the only way I have is by saying goodbye and jamming when it happens. And so I hope your audience forgives and understands my position. When people get that uncivil and that unnasty, or that nasty, I think I have to take my own steps in trying to make our world a little more civil and beautiful.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
No, and I think that's to only be respected. The only thing I'll say, if I may, in Vocab's defense, because he is one of the more civil people I've come in contact with, I think I would assume anyway that he was trying to be I guess, sarcastic maybe, or facetious to the audience to kind of spark up more interest for a potential conversation, and it kind of went left, maybe not even realizing that you would take it that way. And again, I'm speaking for him because he's not here to speak for himself, and that's just an assumption on my part. But I do understand exactly where you're coming from, because that has become commonplace, even when it's not necessarily meant to be that way. And I think that's one of the reasons I open up the way I do, where I say we can disagree without being disrespectfully.
I love that feature. I love that feature of your show. Oh, GMG, I loved you. You know, and I got such a great vibe from it. I absolutely wanted to come on and talk to you. I respect you, and I hope I didn't misinterpret him. But when people get personal, when people make moral accusations like everything he says is a lie, and they get ad hominem like that, I draw a line, and I make it a rule. I want the world to be a place where we can have, you know, a safe space, in other words, for civil conversation, so we can advance the ball. I'm not omniscient. I'm not infallible. But the only way we're going to make progress is if we have a civil exchange, and we can both learn, you know. But getting personal, I don't see the reason for it.
I understand. And please let everybody know where they can get your book. Talk about the documentary, anything, speaking engagement you need people to know about, YouTube channels, what you got going on with Jacob. Please speak on all of that.
I frequently appear with Jacob over on History Valley. He's kind enough to have me as a guest on frequently, and sometimes I'll even be there asking the questions of the guests with him when I'm lucky enough. He is a good buddy of mine. I'm very active on social media. I'm over at Facebook answering questions about this stuff every day, almost every day of the year. I'm over there answering questions about this stuff. So come over to Facebook and ask me questions if you want. We have a website, www.creatingchrist.com. You can see the book behind me here is the cover of the book. It's available at Amazon, Creating Christ by James Valliant and Warren Fay, and at barnesandnoble.com. I'm active with the Ayn Rand Center, United Kingdom. I do podcasts, multiple podcasts every week for a podcast based out of London.
That'll work. I definitely appreciate the time, and hopefully we can be as much of a fixture over here as you are over on History Valley. Jacob is a good friend of mine, and I definitely respect and appreciate what he has going on over there. And so we look forward to you coming back over here and engaging in some of this information on a regular basis. So definitely,
I would be honored to, my friend. Yeah,
absolutely. So again, hey, you guys, please support the work. Please go over to his Facebook page. Please get the book. Before you pass any judgment, you have to check out the work. And so please go get the book. Check out the podcast. Go over to Jacob's channel, History Valley. Check him out over there. Really, really, really good brother. Jacob got us together when I was dealing with a particularly difficult situation, gave me some really good advice before we even got into any of this potential YouTube interview stuff. So very, very good brother, very genuine. So please support him and go over and check out what he has going on. And again, he'll be back, and we'll definitely open up the lines for some potential conversations, and definitely have some more interviews about his work, his theories, and how he feels this thing called Christianity came to be. I definitely appreciate your time, sir, and I'm definitely looking forward to you coming back.
And I appreciate you having me on, sir. Thank you very much.
Absolutely. All right, family. That's been Paradigm Shift TV 314. I'm your brother, DMG the Poet. We are out. Until next time, we'll be black. That is peace.